When Jackson Thornhill found the blood in the snow, he had no idea he was about to break 7 years of self-imposed exile from humanity. The crimson stain against pristine white told a story of desperation, small footprints fleeing larger ones pursuing. What he discovered in that abandoned shed would shatter his solitary existence forever, a woman brutally shorn and beaten protecting a terrified child from monsters wearing human faces. But in the frozen wilderness of 1882, Montana mercy could be deadlier than cruelty. Some acts of kindness demand everything, including your life. This is their story. Before we begin, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from, so I can see how far this tale travels across the world. The winter of 1882 descended upon Montana territory, like God's own judgment, swift, merciless, and absolute. Snow fell in sheets so thick they erased the boundary between earth and sky, transforming the rugged landscape into a realm of ghostly silence, where only the strongest survived. Jackson Thornhill moved through this frozen wilderness like a specter himself, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air as he tracked what he hoped was deer sign. At 45, his body still carried the hard-earned strength of a soldier, though 7 years had passed since he'd last worn the uniform. His beard, once coal-black, now showed threads of silver, much like the forest around him, where ancient pines wore mantles of ice and snow. But these weren't deer tracks cutting across the pristine white. Jackson crouched, running his gloved fingers over the impressions his weathered face gave beneath the brim of his worn leather hat. Human footprints, small and hurried, sinking deep into the powder. Beside them, larger prints followed with deliberate purpose. Someone was being hunted. Jackson straightened his tall frame, rising like a solitary pine against the backdrop of endless white. The wind moaned through the trees, carrying whispers of an approaching storm, and something else, the metallic scent of fear. He adjusted his rifle and followed the tracks, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned to survive by remaining unnoticed. Then he saw it, a splash of crimson against white. Blood on snow. The stain was still fresh enough to retain its vivid color, too much blood for a simple fall. Jackson's jaw tightened as old instincts awakened. During the war, he'd seen enough blood to know when someone was in mortal danger. A wounded animal might explain the crimson, but not the desperate pace of those smaller footprints or the methodical pursuit that followed. The crack of a gunshot shattered the winter silence. Jackson dropped to one knee instinctively, his rifle ready. The echo bounced between the mountains, making it impossible to determine direction. He waited, counting heartbeats in the deadly quiet. 3, 4, 5. Another shot rang out closer this time. He moved toward the sound, stepping carefully through the deep snow. Behind him lay his cabin, 2 miles of safety he'd built with his own hands after returning from the war. After coming home to find his wife Catherine murdered by raiders while he fought in distant battlefields, the cabin had been his fortress against the world, a place where memories of war and loss couldn't follow. But now something pulled him forward through the storm. The trees thinned ahead, revealing a small clearing. Jackson paused at the edge, every sense alert. Movement caught his eye, a flash of dark cloth against the snow. He raised his rifle, then slowly lowered it as he realized what he was seeing. A child, a small girl, huddled behind the trunk of a fallen pine, her dark hair dusted with snowflakes, her thin coat woefully inadequate against the killing cold. She couldn't be more than 10 years old. As if sensing his presence, she turned. Her eyes widened with a terror that struck Jackson like a physical blow, the look of someone who expected only cruelty from the world. "Easy now," Jackson said, setting his rifle down deliberately and raising his empty hands. "I won't hurt you." The girl remained frozen, her gaze darting between him and the trees behind her. Her face was pale with cold, and fear her lips nearly blue from exposure. Jackson recognized that look from the war, the expression of someone hunted someone who had seen too much. "Are you alone?" he asked, keeping his distance. She shook her head, then seemed to reconsider. Tears welled in her eyes, threatening to freeze on her cheeks. "Please," she whispered the word, forming a small cloud between them. "My mama needs help. They hurt her bad." Jackson's chest tightened. The tracks, the blood, the gunshots, they formed a picture he'd seen before, both in war and in the lawless territories where the strong preyed upon the weak. "Where is she?" he asked gently. The girl pointed with a trembling hand toward a break in the trees. "In the old shed. I ran to find help, but they were coming and I had to hide." Her voice broke. "Please hurry. She's so cold." Jackson picked up his rifle and nodded once. "Show me." The girl hesitated only a moment before emerging from her hiding place. "My name's Abigail," she told him, as she led the way through the snow, her small boots sinking deep with each step. She glanced back constantly, fear sharpening her young features. "Who's after you, Abigail?" Jackson asked, scanning the trees around them. "My Uncle Vernon and his men," she replied, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They did awful things to Mama. Cut off all her hair. Said no one would want her now." But Jackson's jaw tightened. He'd seen the cruelty men could inflict, especially on those weaker than themselves. It was one of the reasons he'd retreated to this isolated stretch of wilderness after the war, to escape the knowledge of what humans were capable of doing to one another. The abandoned shed appeared ahead, half collapsed under the weight of snow and neglect. It had once been part of a homestead long since abandoned, when the harsh Montana winters proved too brutal for its hopeful occupants. "In there," Abigail said, pointing to the sagging doorway. Jackson approached cautiously, listening for any sound of pursuers. The forest remained eerily quiet, as if the very trees were holding their breath. "Stay behind me," he instructed, then pushed open the door. Cold air rushed out, carrying the unmistakable metallic scent of blood. The interior was dim, illuminated only by weak light filtering through gaps in the walls. At first, Jackson saw nothing but shadows and the remnants of old farm equipment. Then his eyes adjusted, and he saw her. A woman lay crumpled against the far wall, still as death. Her dress was torn and stained dark where blood had frozen into the fabric. But what caught Jackson's attention was her head completely shaved, the pale skin marred by cuts and bruises. She looked broken, discarded like something no longer of value. "Mama," Abigail pushed past him with a cry. "We found help." The woman's eyes fluttered open, revealing a gaze clouded with pain, but still alert. She tried to sit up, failed, and collapsed back with a soft moan. Jackson approached slowly, kneeling beside her. Up close, he could see the extent of her injuries, a split lip, bruised cheekbone, and numerous small cuts on her scalp where someone had taken their time making sure she suffered. "Ma'am, I'm Jackson Thornhill," he said quietly. "Your daughter found me. I have a cabin not far from here. We need to get you somewhere warm." Fear flickered across her face. She reached for Abigail with a trembling hand. "Go," she whispered. "Take my girl. Leave me." "I'm not leaving you, Mama," Abigail cried, clutching her mother's hand. "Neither am I," Jackson said firmly. "Can you tell me your name?" The woman's eyes searched his face, looking for deceit or cruelty. Finding neither, she whispered, Eleanor Reed." "Mrs. Reed, I'm going to carry you to my cabin. It's a fair distance, but the storm's coming in fast. We need to move now." As he spoke, the wind outside rose to a howl, driving snow through the gaps in the wooden walls. Eleanor shivered violently, and Jackson saw that her lips had taken on a bluish tinge, the beginning stages of hypothermia. Without waiting for a response, he removed his heavy coat and wrapped it around her. Then he lifted her as gently as possible, surprised at how little she weighed. Her body tensed at his touch, the involuntary response of someone who had learned to expect pain from human contact. "Abigail, stay close," he instructed. Outside, the snow was falling harder, already beginning to cover their tracks. Jackson set a brisk pace, mindful of the precious burden in his arms and the child struggling to keep up beside him. Each time he looked down at Eleanor's shaved head, something cold and hard settled in his chest, a feeling he thought he'd buried with Catherine. Rage. "What kind of man does this to a woman?" He muttered, more to himself than to his companions. "My husband's brother," Eleanor murmured, her voice barely audible. "Family." The word held such bitter irony that Jackson's grip tightened protectively around her. Eleanor drifted in and out of consciousness as they traveled, occasionally murmuring words he couldn't catch. Abigail trudged beside him in silence, her small face set with determination beyond her years. The gunshots had stopped, but Jackson remained vigilant, aware that the men who had done this might still be searching. The storm would cover their tracks, but it also made the journey treacherous. By the time his cabin came into view, the snow was nearly knee-deep, and darkness was falling fast. The cabin stood solid against the white landscape smoke rising from the stone chimney where his morning fire still smoldered. Jackson had built it to last thick logs and a sturdy roof that could withstand the heaviest snowfall. It wasn't large, but it was strong, a fortress, against both weather and the memories that haunted him. He kicked the door open and carried Eleanor inside, the warmth enveloping them after the bitter cold. The single room was sparse but orderly, a table and 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, shelves of supplies, and a bed in the corner. Another small door led to a storage room he used for curing meat and storing firewood. Jackson laid Eleanor gently on the bed, Catherine's bed, untouched since her death, except for fresh linens he couldn't bring himself to remove. Something twisted inside him at the sight of another woman lying there, but he pushed the feeling aside. There was no time for ghosts. "Abigail, stoke the fire," he instructed, turning his attention to Eleanor. Her breathing was shallow, her skin alarmingly cold to the touch. As Abigail added logs to the embers, Jackson gathered what he needed: clean rags, his medical supplies, and a kettle of water to heat. 7 years of solitude had taught him self-sufficiency, including basic medical skills. During the war, he'd assisted field surgeons often enough to know how to clean and dress wounds. But as he began to remove the coat from Eleanor to assess her injuries, her eyes flew open, filled with terror. Her hand weakly caught his wrist. "Don't," she whispered. "Mrs. Reed, I need to tend your wounds," he explained, keeping his voice steady. "I was a field medic during the war. I know what I'm doing." She shook her head slightly, her gaze darting to Abigail, who was now watching anxiously from beside the fire. Jackson understood. "Abigail," he said, turning to the girl, "I need you to fill the water bucket from the barrel outside. Can you do that?" The child hesitated, reluctant to leave her mother. "It's all right, Abby," Eleanor murmured. "Go help." After Abigail went outside, Jackson spoke softly to Eleanor. "I'll be as quick as I can. I need to see how badly you're hurt." She gave a nearly imperceptible nod, and he proceeded carefully. The torn and bloodied dress revealed a chemise beneath the fabric soaked through, where wounds had bled, adhering to her skin. Her arms and shoulders were mottled with bruises in various stages of healing, evidence that the abuse had been ongoing. Jackson worked methodically, his face betraying none of the anger building inside him. He'd seen injuries like these before during the war prisoners who had been beaten systematically day after day. "They enjoyed it," Eleanor whispered suddenly, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. "Taking their time making it last." Jackson didn't respond immediately, focusing on cleaning a particularly deep cut on her shoulder. Finally, he said, "Men who hurt women and children aren't men at all. They're cowards." A faint, bitter smile touched her lips. "My husband's brother and his friends. Family." The door opened as Abigail returned with water. Jackson quickly covered Eleanor with a blanket and took the bucket. "Thank you. Now find something to eat in that cupboard over there. There's dried beef and some hardtack." While Abigail searched for food, Jackson heated water and continued tending to Eleanor's injuries. The worst was a deep gash along her ribs that would need stitches. He explained what he needed to do, and she nodded, her jaw set with grim determination. "I've had worse," she said, though they both knew it was a lie. As he worked, memories of the battlefield surfaced, the cries of wounded men, the smell of gunpowder and blood, the constant struggle to save those who could be saved and ease the passing of those who couldn't. He had been a teacher before the war, not a doctor, but necessity had made him learn quickly. When he reached the wounds on her scalp, his hands slowed. The shearing had been done brutally, leaving cuts and abrasions across her head. He cleaned each one with gentle precision, noting how Eleanor closed her eyes tightly, tears seeping from beneath her lids. "It grows back," he said quietly, offering the only comfort he could. "They said no man would look at me now," she whispered. "That I was marked as worthless." Jackson's hands paused in their work. "Men who would judge a woman by her hair aren't worth your time, Mrs. Reed." Her eyes opened, studying him with surprise, as if such a simple truth had never occurred to her. As he worked on the final cuts, his fingers brushed against something unexpected, a small, hard edge beneath the fabric of her tattered chemise. Eleanor tensed immediately. "What is it?" he asked, drawing back. "Nothing," she said too quickly. Jackson met her gaze steadily. "Mrs. Reed, if you're hiding something that might put my home at risk, I need to know." After a long moment, she nodded slightly. "Inside the lining, a page from my husband's Bible. It has information. That's why they want it. Why they did this to me." Carefully, Jackson located the small tear in the chemise's lining and extracted a folded piece of paper. It was indeed torn from a Bible, the thin paper bearing verses from the Book of Psalms. But in the margins, written in red ink, was an address in Boston and what appeared to be a coded message. "This is what they're after?" he asked. Eleanor nodded weakly. "My husband left something with a lawyer in Boston. Vernon, his brother, wants it, thinks it's his by right." "And is it?" A flash of defiance crossed her face. "No, it belongs to Abigail. Harold made sure of that before he died." Jackson refolded the paper and returned it to her. "Then we'll keep it safe." By the time he finished tending her wounds, the storm outside had grown into a full blizzard. Wind howled around the cabin, rattling the shutters, while snow piled against the walls. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and Jackson knew no one would be traveling in such conditions, not even men bent on violence. He finished bandaging Eleanor's wounds and helped her into one of his clean shirts, which hung like a tent on her thin frame. Throughout it all, she remained stoic, only the occasional sharp intake of breath betraying her pain. Abigail had fallen asleep by the fire, exhaustion finally overtaking her fear. Jackson carefully lifted the child and placed her on the bearskin rug near the hearth, covering her with a woolen blanket. Then he turned back to Eleanor. "You need rest. Take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire." Eleanor's eyes were already closing, her body surrendering to exhaustion now that she was warm, and her wounds were tended. "Why are you helping us?" She murmured the question, barely audible. Jackson stared into the flames for a long moment. "Because 7 years ago no one helped my wife when she needed it. I wasn't there to protect her, but I'm here now." He wasn't sure if Eleanor heard him. Her breathing had deepened into sleep, her body finally yielding to the safety of the moment. Jackson added more logs to the fire, then settled into his chair rifle across his lap. The storm would keep her pursuers at bay for now, but they would come. Men like that always did. As the night deepened, Jackson watched over the sleeping figures, the woman with her shorn head, and the child curled beside the fire. For the first time in 7 years, his cabin held something besides memories and regrets. It held lives that depended on him. Outside, the wind howled like the voices of the damned, but inside, 3 souls found shelter from the storm. Jackson had thought his capacity for caring had died with Catherine buried beneath 7 winters of isolation and grief. But watching Eleanor's chest rise and fall, seeing Abigail's peaceful face in sleep, he felt something stir within him, something he'd thought lost forever. The will to fight. Not just for survival, but for something worth protecting. Dawn was still hours away, and with it would come new dangers. Vernon Reed and his men wouldn't give up easily. They would search, and eventually they would find this place. When they did, Jackson Thornhill would be ready. The teacher from Pennsylvania, the soldier who had failed to save his wife, the hermit who had hidden from the world, all those men had led to this moment. And perhaps Jackson thought as he watched over his unexpected charges that had been the purpose all along. To be here. To stand between innocence and evil. To prove that some promises are worth keeping even when they're made to strangers in the dark. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin hope took root like the first green shoots after a harsh winter. Fragile, but persistent. And perhaps, just perhaps, strong enough to survive whatever was coming. Eleanor woke to pain and unfamiliar surroundings. For a terrifying moment, she thought she was back in the shed, or worse, returned to Vernon's house. Then she felt the softness beneath her, and the warmth of the blanket covering her, a blanket unlike any she'd seen, with patterns that seemed to tell a story in thread and color. Sunlight streamed through a small window, illuminating a cabin that was both foreign and somehow welcoming. The air smelled of wood smoke and coffee, rich and comforting after months of fear. She tried to sit up, but gasped as pain shot through her ribs. "Careful," a deep voice cautioned. "Those stitches need time." Eleanor turned to see Jackson Thornhill standing by a cast-iron stove, his tall frame slightly stooped in the confines of the cabin. In daylight, she could see him clearly for the first time. The weathered face framed by a dark beard flecked with gray eyes, the color of gunmetal, watchful and measuring. He looked like what he was, a man who had seen too much of the world's harshness. "Abigail," she asked, her voice cracking with dryness. "Outside feeding the chickens." He poured water into a cup and brought it to her. "She's a brave girl. Reminds me of someone I used to know." Eleanor accepted the water gratefully, noting how he was careful not to touch her hand as he passed the cup. A consideration born of understanding rather than revulsion. "Thank you," she said after drinking. "For everything." Jackson nodded once, then returned to the stove. "Blizzard's passed, but there's 3 feet of snow out there. No one's traveling for a few days at least." Relief washed over her. A few days of safety seemed an impossible luxury after months of constant fear. "Are you hungry?" he asked, stirring something in a pot. Eleanor realized she was starving. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten a proper meal. At Vernon's house, she'd been lucky to get scraps from the kitchen. "Yes," she admitted. He brought her a bowl of stew, simple fare, but the rich smell made her mouth water. As she ate, she studied the cabin more carefully. It was small, but surprisingly comfortable, with shelves of books along one wall, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and a neat stack of firewood beside the hearth. Everything had its place, suggesting a man accustomed to order and solitude. But what caught her attention was a small framed photograph on a shelf above the fireplace, a woman with dark hair and a gentle smile, standing beside a younger version of Jackson. It was the only personal item in an otherwise utilitarian space. "Your wife?" she asked, nodding toward the photograph. A shadow crossed Jackson's face. "Yes, Catherine. She's beautiful." "She was," he agreed, his tone making it clear he didn't wish to discuss her further. Eleanor turned her attention back to the stew, understanding all too well the pain of lost love. Her own husband Harold had been dead just over a year, taken by pneumonia after a winter journey to expand his business. Unlike Catherine, there were no photographs to remember him by. Vernon had destroyed them all, claiming they were his property as head of the family. The door burst open and Abigail rushed in, her cheeks flushed with cold and excitement. "Mama, you're awake!" She ran to the bed and threw her arms around Eleanor, who winced, but returned the embrace fiercely. "Careful of your mother's wounds," Jackson cautioned, but his voice held no real reproach. Abigail loosened her grip, but remained pressed against Eleanor's side. "Mr. Thornhill has chickens, Mama and a horse in the barn, and he showed me where the stream is under the ice." Eleanor smiled at her daughter's animation. It had been so long since she'd seen Abigail this excited. At Vernon's house, the child had learned to make herself invisible, to speak only when spoken to. "Did you thank Mr. Thornhill for showing you these things?" she asked. Abigail nodded earnestly. "Yes, ma'am, and I helped feed the animals like he showed me." Jackson moved about the cabin, putting things in order with efficient movements. "She's a good helper," he said, glancing at Abigail. "Quick to learn." Pride warmed Eleanor's chest despite her injuries. She always has been. The morning passed in quiet activity. Jackson tended to chores outside, while Eleanor rested her body demanding sleep as it began the process of healing. Abigail alternated between helping Jackson and sitting beside her mother, chattering about the cabin and its surroundings with the resilience of childhood. By afternoon, Eleanor felt strong enough to sit up properly, though her ribs protested every movement. She found a small mirror on a shelf and hesitantly lifted it to examine herself. The face that looked back was a stranger's, pale gaunt, with dark circles beneath her eyes. Her scalp was a landscape of small cuts and bruises where hair had been roughly shorn away. Vernon had known exactly what he was doing when he ordered her head shaved. In their small religious community, a woman's hair was her glory. To be shorn was to be marked as fallen immoral. No respectable person would help her after that. A soft noise made her look up. Jackson stood in the doorway, snow melting from his boots, watching her with an unreadable expression. "It looks worse than it is," she said, setting the mirror down. "I've seen worse," he replied simply. "Men who lost limbs, skin burned away, hair grows back. The rest heals too, given time." His matter-of-fact tone was oddly comforting. There was no pity in it, no disgust, just the practical assessment of someone who understood that bodies could be broken and mended. "Vernon didn't think so," she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. "He said I'd be marked forever, that everyone would know what I was." Jackson removed his coat and hung it by the door. And what are you, Mrs. Reed, that deserves such treatment? The question caught her off guard. What was she? A widow? A mother? A woman who had once taught music to children in St. Louis before marrying Harold and moving west. A woman who had failed to provide the Reed family with a male heir. A disappointment, she said, finally the word bitter on her tongue. Jackson crossed to the fireplace and added a log, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. That's not an answer, he set his back to her. That's what someone else decided you were. Before she could respond, Abigail emerged from the storage room where she'd been exploring with Jackson's permission. Mama, look what I found. She held up an old book, its leather cover worn smooth with age. Mr. Thornhill has lots of books, more than the schoolhouse back home. Eleanor glanced at Jackson in surprise. Books were uncommon in frontier cabins, where practical concerns usually outweighed literary ones. I was a teacher, he said, answering her unspoken question. Before the war. This revelation shifted something in Eleanor's perception of him. She had assumed he was like most men in these territories, perhaps a trapper or a failed prospector, someone who valued strength over knowledge. The idea that he had once stood before a classroom imparting wisdom to children seemed at odds with the solitary figure who had carried her through the snow. What did you teach? She asked. History, literature, whatever the town needed. He shrugged, as if dismissing that part of his life. It was a long time ago. Abigail opened the book, running her fingers over the pages. Can I read it? If you'd like, Jackson replied. It's The Last of the Mohicans. Not an easy read, but a good story. I can read hard books, Abigail declared proudly. Mama taught me. She was a teacher too before we came to live with Uncle Vernon. Jackson's eyebrows rose slightly as he glanced at Eleanor. Is that so? Eleanor nodded. I taught piano mostly, but reading and arithmetic too when needed. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Teachers seem to wash up in strange places out here. For the first time since their arrival, the atmosphere in the cabin lightened. Abigail settled by the fire with the book, while Jackson prepared a simple dinner. Eleanor watched them, struck by how quickly her daughter had adapted to this strange man in his isolated home. Children were resilient in ways adults could not match. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped sharply. Jackson built up the fire and placed extra blankets on the bearskin rug where Abigail would sleep. Cold snaps setting in, he explained. It'll be 15 below by morning. Eleanor thought of the shed where he'd found them, of how close they had come to freezing to death. A shiver ran through her that had nothing to do with the current temperature. We would have died there, she said quietly when Abigail was out of earshot, having gone to use the outhouse before bed. Jackson paused in his preparations. Yes, you would have. Why did you help us truly? She pressed. You could have left us. Many would have. He turned to face her, his expression grave. During the war, I saw men walk past the suffering of others because it wasn't their concern. I swore I wouldn't become that kind of man. He paused, old pain flickering across his features. And when Catherine died, it was because no one stopped to help when raiders came through our valley. I was away fighting, and our neighbors decided it wasn't their problem. The raw pain in his voice was evident even after 7 years. Eleanor understood then that helping them wasn't just an act of kindness, it was atonement for a past he couldn't change. I'm sorry about your wife, she said softly. He nodded once, accepting her sympathy without comment. Then, as if the conversation had become too personal, he returned to his tasks, checking the security of the windows and door, before settling into his chair by the fire. That night, as the wind howled outside and the temperature plummeted, Eleanor lay awake beneath the colorful blanket, listening to Jackson's steady breathing from his place by the hearth. Abigail slept soundly on her rug, exhaustion overcoming the strangeness of their situation. Eleanor's thoughts turned to the piece of paper hidden in her clothes, the page that Vernon would kill to possess. Harold had known his brother's true nature, even if he'd never spoken of it openly. In his final days, as pneumonia ravaged his lungs, he had torn a page from his Bible and written instructions for Eleanor how to find the lawyer in Boston, how to secure Abigail's inheritance. "Vernon will try to take everything," Harold had whispered, his breath rattling in his chest. "He's always been greedy, but what's mine is Abigail's. I've made sure of it." Eleanor had promised to follow his instructions, but after Harold's death, Vernon had moved quickly, bringing them to live in his house under the guise of family duty. At first he had been almost kind, if distant. Then the questions about Harold's affairs had begun growing more insistent with each passing day. When she refused to reveal what she knew, the abuse started subtle at first, then increasingly open. By the time she realized the danger they were in, it was too late. Vernon had confiscated their belongings, destroyed their identification papers, and effectively imprisoned them in his home. Their escape had been desperate and ill-planned, made possible only because one of Vernon's servants, a young girl who had witnessed Eleanor's mistreatment, left a door unlocked during the night. Now, lying in a stranger's bed, Eleanor wondered if they had merely traded one danger for another. Jackson Thornhill had been kind, but she had learned the hard way that men's kindness could vanish like morning mist. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the healing blanket he had placed over her. It smelled of herbs and smoke, foreign, yet comforting. For now, at least, they were safe. The storm would keep Vernon away, and Jackson seemed capable of handling trouble when it came. And it would come of that, Eleanor had no doubt. Men like Vernon Reed didn't give up easily, especially when money was involved. Jackson woke before dawn, as was his habit. The cabin was silent except for the soft breathing of his guests and the occasional pop from the banked fire. He rose quietly, added logs to the embers, and prepared for the day ahead. The thermometer outside the window confirmed his prediction 15 degrees below zero, with more cold to come. No one would be traveling in such conditions, but that didn't mean they could afford complacency. Vernon Reed would be searching for his sister-in-law and niece as soon as the weather permitted. Jackson needed to prepare. He dressed warmly and slipped outside into the pre-dawn darkness. The cold hit like a physical blow, instantly freezing the moisture in his beard. The snow around the cabin had drifted nearly to the windowsills, transforming the landscape into something alien and hostile. In the barn, his horse nickered softly in greeting. Jackson fed and watered the animal, then checked his small flock of chickens. Survival on the frontier required planning and redundancy, multiple sources of food, water, and heat. His years alone had taught him to leave nothing to chance. As he worked, his mind turned over the problem of Eleanor and Abigail Reed. The smart course would be to send them on their way once the weather cleared, point them toward the nearest town, and wash his hands of their troubles. Getting involved in a family dispute, especially one that had already turned violent, was asking for complications he didn't need. But the image of Eleanor's shaved head and battered body kept returning to him. The way Vernon Reed had marked her, intending to make her an outcast that no one would help. The way Abigail had looked at him with absolute trust when he'd covered her with a blanket. They had nowhere else to go. Jackson finished his chores and returned to the cabin, stamping snow from his boots before entering. Eleanor was awake, sitting up in bed, with the colorful healing blanket wrapped around her shoulders. In the soft light of early morning, with her face clean and her eyes clear, he could see traces of the woman she must have been before Vernon Reed's cruelty, proud, intelligent, dignified, despite her circumstances. "You're up early," she observed. "Force of habit," he replied, moving to the stove to heat water for coffee. "How are you feeling?" "Better. Still sore, but better." She touched her ribs gingerly. "You do good work, Mr. Thornhill." "Jackson," he corrected. "If you're staying in my home, you might as well use my name." She nodded, accepting the small shift in formality. "Jack, then, and I'm Eleanor." The use of his given name felt strange after so long. Few people had called him Jackson since Catherine died. In town on his rare visits, he was simply Thornhill, or the widower man, or sometimes that strange fellow who lives up by Broken Fir Creek. "Are you hungry?" he asked, changing the subject. "Yes, but I can help." Eleanor made a move to rise, but he shook his head. "Rest today. Tomorrow's soon enough to start moving around." She settled back, though he could tell it frustrated her to be idle. "At least let me do something. I'm not used to sitting still." Jackson considered, then gestured to a pile of mending on a shelf. "If you're determined there's some sewing needs doing, I'm not much hand with a needle." Relief crossed her face at the prospect of being useful. "I can manage that." He brought her the mending shirts with torn seams, socks with holes along with his sewing kit. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and Eleanor tensed momentarily before accepting the items. "Thank you," she said, already sorting through the work. Jackson nodded and turned away, giving her space. He understood her wariness all too well. Trust was a luxury neither of them could afford to give freely. Abigail woke as the sun rose fully, her eyes widening briefly in confusion before she remembered where she was. "Good morning, Mr. Thornhill," she said, sitting up and rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Good morning, Mama." "Morning, child," Jackson replied. "Breakfast's nearly ready." The day settled into a quiet rhythm. Jackson took Abigail outside briefly to gather more firewood, teaching her which logs burned hottest and how to spot the dry ones beneath the snow. The girl was an eager student, asking questions about everything from the tracks they found around the cabin to the way smoke rose straight up in the frigid air. "You know a lot," she observed as they carried armloads of wood back to the cabin. "I've had time to learn," Jackson replied. "Because you live all alone." He glanced down at her curious face. "Yes. Don't you get lonely?" The question, innocent and direct, caught him off guard. Did he get lonely? Of course he did. But loneliness was preferable to the alternative, the risk of caring for people who could be taken away, as Catherine had been. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but being alone has its advantages too." Abigail considered this seriously. "Like what?" "Well, I don't have to share my breakfast, and no one complains if I don't sweep the floor." A smile broke across her face. "That's not a very good reason to be alone." Despite himself, Jackson felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward. "Perhaps you're right." Inside, Eleanor had made progress on the mending her stitches neat and precise. She looked up as they entered, her eyes immediately checking Abigail for any sign of distress. "We brought lots of wood, Mama," Abigail announced. "And I saw rabbit tracks." "Did you now?" Eleanor smiled, the expression transforming her face despite the bruises. "Perhaps Mr. Thornhill will teach you about tracking." "If the weather holds, I'll need to check my trap line tomorrow," Jackson said. "You can come along if your mother doesn't mind." Abigail turned to Eleanor with pleading eyes. "Can I, Mama, please?" Eleanor hesitated, her instinct to protect her daughter warring with the knowledge that they were safer with Jackson than anywhere else. "If Mr. Thornhill doesn't mind the company," she said finally. "I don't mind," he assured her. "It's good for her to learn these things." As the day progressed, Jackson noticed Eleanor watching him when she thought he wasn't looking, studying his movements, his habits, the way he interacted with Abigail. He recognized the calculation behind her observation. She was trying to determine what kind of man he was, whether they were truly safe with him. It was a reasonable precaution. In her position, he would do the same. Evening came early, as it always did in winter. Jackson prepared a simple meal of cornbread and venison stew, the familiar routine of solitary living, now complicated by the presence of others. Eleanor insisted on helping, this time moving carefully to the table to slice the bread while he stirred the pot. "You cook better than most bachelors I've known," she commented. "Necessity," he explained. "It was either learn or eat poorly." "Did your wife teach you?" "Some," he acknowledged. "Catherine was a fine cook, but I've had 7 years to practice on my own." Eleanor nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Harold couldn't boil water without burning it. I did all the cooking." A small smile touched her lips at the memory. "He tried once to surprise me on my birthday. Nearly burned down the kitchen." It was the first time she'd spoken of her husband with anything but sadness. Jackson found himself curious about the man who had earned her love and loyalty. "How long were you married?" he asked. 6 years, she replied. "We met in St. Louis where I was teaching. Harold was there on business. He sold farm equipment. He was so different from other men who came courting." Her voice softened. "He asked what books I liked to read before he asked if I could cook." Jackson could imagine it, a young Eleanor, with a full head of hair, perhaps seated at a piano, catching the eye of a traveling salesman who recognized her worth beyond her domestic abilities. "Vernon is nothing like him," she continued, her tone hardening. "Brothers by blood only. Where Harold built things, Vernon destroys. Where Harold gave, Vernon takes." "Yet Harold left his brother in charge of his affairs," Jackson observed. Eleanor's hands stilled on the bread knife. "No, that's what Vernon claimed, but it wasn't true. Harold left everything to Abigail with me as trustee until she comes of age." Her voice dropped to ensure Abigail, reading by the fire, couldn't hear. "That's what the paper is about, directions to find Harold's will, the real one, not the forgery Vernon presented after the funeral." Jackson absorbed this information silently. A disputed inheritance explained much about Vernon's pursuit. There was money involved, perhaps significant amounts. Men had killed for far less. "This lawyer in Boston," he said quietly. "He has the will." Eleanor nodded. "And other papers. Proof that Vernon has been embezzling from the company for years. Harold discovered it just before he died." The stakes were higher than Jackson had realized. Vernon Reed wasn't just after an inheritance, he was trying to cover up crimes that could send him to prison. "He'll keep coming," Jackson said, stating the obvious. "Yes." Eleanor met his gaze directly. "I understand if you want us to leave once the weather clears. We've brought enough trouble to your door." Jackson considered his response carefully. The sensible answer was yes, they should move on, take their problems elsewhere. But the thought of sending them out into the winter with Vernon Reed hunting them turned his stomach. "We'll discuss it when the time comes," he said finally. "For now, you're not going anywhere in this cold." Relief flickered in Eleanor's eyes, though she tried to hide it. "Thank you." After dinner, while Abigail continued reading her book, Jackson retrieved his journal from a shelf and sat at the table. It was his nightly ritual, recording the day's events, the weather, any significant observations about the land and its creatures. In a life of solitude, The journal had become both record and companion, a way of marking his existence in a world that had largely forgotten him. Eleanor watched him curiously from her place on the bed. "You keep a journal. Habit from teaching days," he explained without looking up. "Makes you pay attention to things you might otherwise miss." "Like what?" He considered the question. "Like how the juniper berries are more plentiful this winter than last. Like how the creek ice froze in patterns that look like fern leaves." "Small things," Eleanor said softly. "Important things," he corrected gently. Jackson glanced up, surprised by her understanding. Most people would consider his observations trivial, the musings of a lonely man with too much time on his hands. But Eleanor seemed to grasp their significance, that in noticing the details of the natural world, he maintained a connection to life itself. "Yes," he agreed. "Important things." Later, as the fire burned low, and Abigail slept soundly on her bearskin rug, Jackson heard Eleanor stirring restlessly in the bed. He turned from his position in the chair to find her sitting up, arms wrapped around her knees, staring into the darkness. "Can't sleep?" he asked quietly. She startled slightly, then relaxed when she saw him watching. "Bad dreams," she admitted. "They come most nights now." Jackson nodded, familiar with nightmares that refused to fade with time. "Want to talk about them?" "No," she paused. "But thank you for offering." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the howl of wind outside. "Do they ever go away?" Eleanor asked finally. "The dreams." Jackson considered lying, offering the comfort of false hope. But she deserved honesty. "Not entirely. They change, though become less frequent, less powerful." "I dream of Vernon finding us," she confessed. "Of what he'll do to Abigail if he catches us." "He won't," Jackson said with quiet certainty. "You can't know that." "I can promise to do everything in my power to prevent it," he countered. "And I keep my promises, Eleanor." She studied him in the dim light, weighing his words. "I believe you do," she said finally, and lay back down, pulling the healing blanket close around her shoulders. Jackson remained awake long after her breathing had deepened into sleep. He stared into the dying embers, thinking of promises, those kept, and those broken. He had promised Catherine he would return from the war. He had kept that promise, but too late to save her. Now he had made another promise to a woman he barely knew. But this time he had the power to keep it. Vernon Reed and his men might come, but they would not find Jackson Thornhill unprepared. Outside, the wind died suddenly, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the occasional crack of a tree branch snapping under the weight of ice. The storm had passed, and with its passing, the countdown began. Soon the snow would settle enough for travel, and the world would find its way to his door once more. Jackson added another log to the fire and settled back in his chair, rifle, within easy reach. He would be ready when it did. The next 3 days passed in a pattern that grew increasingly familiar. Each morning, Jackson rose before dawn to tend to the animals and check the perimeter of his property for any sign of intruders. Eleanor gained strength daily, moving around the cabin with more confidence, while Abigail shadowed Jackson during his chores, absorbing knowledge about survival in the harsh Montana winter. On the 4th morning, Jackson woke from a fitful sleep to the sound of screaming. He was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, before recognizing the cries as his own voice echoing off the cabin walls. The nightmare, always the same one, had returned, Catherine calling his name as flames consumed their home, the raiders laughing as they rode away, his desperate race through the woods arriving too late. Eleanor was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with concern. Abigail had pressed herself into a corner, frightened by his sudden violence. "I'm sorry," Jackson said, setting the rifle down carefully. "Bad dream." Eleanor nodded, understanding in her gaze. "It's all right. We all have them." He moved to the door, needing air, needing space from the suffocating weight of memory. Outside, the world was transformed. The temperature had risen overnight, and a gentle thaw had begun dripping from the eaves in a steady rhythm. The snow remained deep, but its crust had softened. Jackson filled his lungs with the crisp, morning air, forcing his heartbeat to slow. It had been weeks since the last nightmare, and he'd foolishly hoped they were fading at last. But perhaps having others in his space, in Catherine's space, had stirred the ghosts he'd tried so hard to put to rest. The door opened behind him, and he turned to find Eleanor standing there, wrapped in his coat. She moved carefully, her injuries still healing, but with more strength than he'd expected. "You should be resting," he said. "I've rested enough." She joined him on the porch, maintaining a respectful distance. "The war," he understood she was asking about his nightmare. "Partly. The aftermath more so." Eleanor nodded, not pressing for details he wasn't ready to give. Instead, she looked out at the softening landscape. "The thaw's coming early." "Yes." Jackson didn't elaborate on what they both knew, that the improved weather meant travel would soon be possible for them and for Vernon Reed. They stood in silence for a moment, breath forming clouds in the morning air. "Abigail's taken to you," Eleanor said finally. "She talks about you constantly when you're outside. Mr. Thornhill knows how to track rabbits. Mr. Thornhill can tell when a storm is coming just by smelling the air." Despite himself, Jackson felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the rising temperature. "She's a bright child, observant like her father." Eleanor's voice held both fondness and sorrow. Harold noticed things others missed. It made him a good salesman. He could read people understand what they needed before they knew themselves. "And you?" Jackson asked. "What did he see in you?" Eleanor seemed surprised by the question. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "I asked him once. He said he liked how I closed my eyes when I played the piano, like I was hearing something no one else could." The image was vivid, Eleanor at a piano, lost in music, Harold watching with growing admiration. It spoke of a genuine connection, a true partnership. "He sounds like a good man," Jackson said. "He was." Eleanor pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders. "Vernon was jealous of him. Always has been. Harold was the younger brother, but he was more successful, better liked." Her mouth tightened. After Harold died, Vernon told everyone how he'd step in, take care of his brother's widow and child. He played the role of the benevolent patriarch perfectly. "Until you were behind closed doors," Jackson guessed. Eleanor nodded. "At first it was small things, forgetting to give me mail, restricting my access to funds Harold had left. Then he began spreading rumors that I was unstable with grief, that I needed supervision. By the time I realized what was happening, we were prisoners in all but name." "Why didn't you run sooner?" "I tried once." She touched her scalp unconsciously. "That's when this happened. Vernon said if I tried again, it would be Abigail who suffered. I believed him." Jackson's jaw tightened. "What changed?" "I overheard him talking to his men. They were planning to have me committed to an asylum, declare me insane and unfit to care for Abigail. They would have separated us permanently." Her eyes hardened. "I decided I'd rather die trying to escape than live without my daughter." The door opened again, and Abigail peered out cautiously. Seeing that the adults were calm, she stepped onto the porch. "Mama, are you all right?" Her voice was small, still uncertain after Jackson's violent awakening. "I'm fine, sweetheart." Eleanor held out an arm, and Abigail pressed against her side. "Mr. Thornhill had a bad dream, that's all. Like the ones you sometimes have." Abigail looked up at Jackson with newfound understanding. "About scary things that happened before?" "Yes," he said simply. "About scary things that happened before." The child nodded solemnly. "I have those too. About Uncle Vernon." Jackson and Eleanor exchanged a glance over Abigail's head. The girl had witnessed more than either of them had realized. "Well," Jackson said deliberately, lightening his tone, "bad dreams can't hurt us in the daylight, and we have work to do." He gestured toward the softening snow. "Weather like this, we should check the trap line. Want to come along?" Abigail's face brightened. "Can I, Mama?" Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. "Stay close to Mr. Thornhill and do exactly as he says." "I will." The girl was already bouncing with excitement. "Let's eat first," Jackson suggested, ushering them back inside. "It's a fair distance to the traps." After a breakfast of cornmeal mush, sweetened with the last of Jackson's molasses, he and Abigail prepared for their expedition. Jackson helped the girl bundle up in one of his old shirts, cut down to serve as an extra layer beneath her coat. He showed her how to wrap strips of hide around her boots for better traction in the snow. "We'll be back before midday," he told Eleanor, who was clearly anxious about their departure despite her agreement. "Stay inside. Keep the door barred," he added quietly. She nodded, handing Abigail a knitted scarf to wrap around her face. "Be careful, both of you." Outside, the day had warmed further, the snow turning soft and wet. Jackson set a deliberate pace, keeping to areas where the snow had been packed down by his previous passages. Abigail followed in his footsteps, her face serious with concentration. "How far are your traps?" she asked as they crossed a small clearing. "About a mile out in different directions," he replied. "We'll check the closest ones today." "Have you always been a trapper?" Jackson glanced down at her curious face. "No, I've been many things." "Like what? A soldier, a teacher before that." Abigail's eyes widened. "A real teacher, with a schoolhouse and everything. Yes, in a small town in Pennsylvania before the war." "What did you teach the children?" "Reading, writing, history." Jackson smiled slightly at the memory. "Shakespeare when the school board wasn't looking." "What's Shakespeare?" "A man who wrote plays stories that actors perform on stage. He lived a long time ago in England." Abigail considered this new information. "Did you like being a teacher?" "I did," Jackson admitted. It had been years since he'd allowed himself to remember that time, the satisfaction of watching young minds expand the simple joy of sharing knowledge. "Why did you stop?" The question, innocent as it was, brought back darker memories. The outbreak of war, the call for volunteers, the patriotic fervor that had swept through his town. He had enlisted believing it would be over quickly, that he would return to his classroom within months. "The war came," he said simply. "Everything changed." Abigail nodded, accepting this explanation with the wisdom of a child who had seen her own world upended by forces beyond her control. They reached the first trap, set near a frozen stream where animals came to drink from holes in the ice. It was empty, the bait taken, but the mechanism unsprung. "Clever fox," Jackson murmured, resetting it with fresh bait from his pack. "See how the tracks go around the trap, he's learned to be careful." Abigail knelt to examine the footprints in the snow. "Will he come back?" "Probably. Animals are creatures of habit." Jackson pointed to other tracks nearby. "Look here. What do you see?" The girl studied the impressions. "They're different. Bigger." "Good eye. Those are wolf tracks. Wolves hunt the same areas as foxes do, following similar game trails." "Are there wolves near your cabin?" Abigail asked, a hint of fear in her voice. "Sometimes, but they avoid humans when they can. They're not the monsters stories make them out to be. They moved on to the next trap, which held a snowshoe hare, its white fur stained red where the trap had caught it. Abigail's eyes widened at the sight. "Is it dead?" she whispered. "Yes," Jackson confirmed, kneeling to remove the animal from the trap. "It was quick. Better than being taken by a predator." "It's so pretty," Abigail said sadly. "I didn't know you killed things." Jackson paused, hearing the genuine distress in her voice. "I only take what I need to survive," he explained. "The fur keeps me warm. The meat feeds me through winter." He met her troubled gaze. "Out here, everything is connected. Everything lives and dies as part of the same cycle." "Like Papa," she said unexpectedly. "He died, and now we're here with you." The simple truth of her observation struck Jackson deeply. Harold Reed's death had set in motion a chain of events that brought his family to Jackson's door, changing all their lives. "That's right," he said softly. "Everything is connected." They checked 2 more traps, finding one empty, and one with a marten, its sleek brown body limp in death. Jackson demonstrated how to properly retrieve the animals without damaging the valuable fur, explaining each step to Abigail, who watched with solemn attention. As they turned back toward the cabin, Jackson noticed the girl was quieter than before, her earlier enthusiasm dampened by the reality of trapping. "It bothers you," he observed. "The animals." Abigail nodded reluctantly. "Mama says God made all creatures and we should respect them." "Your mother is right." Jackson adjusted his pack, the weight of the trapped animals a familiar burden. "Respect doesn't mean we can't use what nature provides. It means we don't take more than we need, and we honor what we take by using it well." The child considered this, her small face thoughtful. "Did the Indians teach you that—" Jackson looked at her in surprise. "What makes you ask about Indians? The blanket you gave Mama. It has Indian patterns, and you have that medicine bag hanging by the door." He had underestimated her powers of observation. The medicine bag, a small leather pouch filled with herbs and small tokens, had been another gift from the Blackfoot healer. "Yes," he acknowledged. "I learned much from the Blackfoot people. After the war, I was lost. They helped me find my way again." "Were you sick?" "In a way." Jackson wasn't sure how to explain to a child the darkness that had consumed him after Catherine's death. The rage, the guilt, the emptiness that had driven him to the brink of ending his own life. "My spirit was sick. A Blackfoot medicine man helped heal it." Abigail nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "Like the blanket is healing Mama." "Something like that." They walked in companionable silence for a while, the sound of melting snow dripping from branches the only interruption. Jackson found himself impressed by the child's resilience, her ability to absorb new experiences, to ask difficult questions, to adapt to circumstances that would overwhelm many adults. "Your father would be proud of you," he said suddenly. Abigail looked up, startled. "Really?" "Yes, you're brave and smart. Those are good qualities." A small smile lit her face. "Papa used to say I was brave. Uncle Vernon said girls shouldn't be brave, that we should be obedient instead." Jackson's jaw tightened. "Your uncle was wrong about many things." As they neared the cabin, Jackson felt a prickle of unease. Something was different. He stopped holding up a hand to signal Abigail to do the same. "What's wrong?" she whispered. Jackson scanned the area carefully, his eyes picking out details most would miss: a branch broken in a way melting snow wouldn't cause a disturbance in the pattern of drips from the eaves. "Someone's been here," he said quietly. Fear flashed across Abigail's face. "Uncle Vernon—" "I don't know. Stay behind me." They approached the cabin cautiously. The door was still closed, the windows intact. No smoke rose from the chimney, which was concerning Eleanor should have maintained the fire in their absence. Jackson set down his pack and drew his rifle, motioning for Abigail to remain hidden behind a woodpile. He circled the cabin once, checking for tracks, and found them on the north side, a single set of boot prints, large and deep, leading to and from the trees. The prints were partially filled with melted snow, indicating they'd been made at least an hour ago. Whoever had visited was likely gone, but Jackson took no chances. He approached the door carefully, noting that the bar was still in place from the inside. "Eleanor," he called. "It's Jackson and Abigail." No response came. Jackson's unease deepened. He signaled Abigail to stay put, then knocked firmly on the door. "Eleanor, if you can hear me, open the door." After a moment that stretched like eternity, he heard movement inside. The bar scraped as it was removed, and the door opened slowly to reveal Eleanor, her face pale but composed. "You're back," she said, relief evident in her voice. "Come inside quickly." Jackson ushered Abigail in ahead of him, then closed and barred the door. The cabin was cold, the fire having died down to embers. Eleanor immediately moved to stoke it, her hands shaking slightly. "What happened?" Jackson asked, setting his rifle aside but keeping it within reach. Eleanor glanced at Abigail, who was watching with wide, frightened eyes. "Abby, would you put more wood on the fire? Mr. Thornhill and I need to talk." The child nodded and busied herself with the task, though Jackson could tell she was straining to hear their conversation. Eleanor led him to the far corner of the cabin and spoke in one voice. "Someone was watching the cabin. I saw him through the window, just a shape at the edge of the trees. He was there for nearly an hour, then left. Did you recognize him?" She shook her head. "He stayed too far away, but it has to be one of Vernon's men." "Why didn't you keep the fire going?" Jackson asked, concerned by how cold the cabin had become. "I was afraid the smoke would confirm someone was here," she said, rubbing her arms, whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell. "I thought it was better to let the fire die down." Jackson nodded, acknowledging her logic. "You did right, but we need to warm up now." He moved to help Abigail with the fire, adding larger logs once the smaller pieces caught. As warmth slowly returned to the cabin, Jackson considered their situation. The thaw meant Vernon's men could now travel, and at least one scout had already found his cabin. It was only a matter of time before they came in force. "We should leave," Eleanor said, reading his thoughts. "Tonight, under cover of darkness." "And go where?" Jackson asked. "The nearest town is 30 miles south. You're not strong enough for that journey yet." "We have no choice. They'll come and they'll hurt you to get to us." Her voice caught. "I won't have another death on my conscience." Jackson studied her face, seeing the guilt and fear warring there. "This isn't your fault, Eleanor. Vernon is the one who chose violence. But we brought it to your door. I opened that door willingly." Jackson moved to the window, checking the tree line where the observer had stood. Besides, running now would be dangerous. If they're watching, they'll follow. Better to face them here where we have shelter and supplies. Eleanor's shoulders slumped in defeat. "Then what do we do?" Jackson turned back to her, his decision made. "We prepare, and we send for help." "Help?" Eleanor's eyes widened. "Who would help us out here?" "I have a friend in Clearwater, Frank Sullivan, the sheriff there. He was my sergeant during the war. If I can get word to him, he'll come." Hope flickered in Eleanor's eyes. "How? We can't leave, and there's no one to carry a message." "There's a way station 10 miles east of here. The mail carrier stops there every week on Thursdays. But Jackson checked the calendar he kept near his journal. That's tomorrow. 10 miles in this snow, you'd never make it back before dark. I have to try. Jackson began gathering supplies, extra ammunition, dried meat, a small flask of whiskey. I'll leave at first light, reach the station by noon, and be back before nightfall. Eleanor watched him, doubt clear on her face. And if Vernon's men come while you're gone, bar the door. Use this. Jackson removed a revolver from a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, checking that it was loaded before handing it to her. Do you know how to use it? Eleanor took the weapon with surprising confidence. Harold taught me. He said a woman alone should know how to protect herself. Smart man. Jackson continued his preparations, aware of Abigail watching them from beside the now roaring fire. I'll show you where to hide if they come a root cellar beneath the storage room. It's small, but it will conceal you both if necessary. As nightfall approached, Jackson completed his preparations for the journey. He showed Eleanor and Abigail the hidden cellar, accessible through a trap door concealed beneath shelving in the storage room. He stocked it with blankets, water, and food enough to last several days if needed. Only use it as a last resort, he instructed. It gets cold down there, and there's limited air. Dinner was a subdued affair, the weight of impending danger hanging over them. Abigail sensed the tension, though she didn't fully understand its cause. She stuck close to Eleanor, her earlier enthusiasm for exploration dampened by fear. After the meal, as Jackson checked his gear one final time, Eleanor approached him by the door. I have something for you, she said, holding out a folded piece of cloth. It's not much, but it might help. Jackson took it, unfolding the fabric to reveal a carefully sewn inner pocket sized to hold the Bible page with its precious information. I noticed you have an inside pocket in your coat, she explained. This will make it more secure. The paper is safer with you than with me, especially if something happens while you're gone. The implications of her gift were clear. She was entrusting him with their future, with the evidence that could free them from Vernon's pursuit. Nothing will happen, Jackson said firmly. But thank you. He carefully transferred the Bible page to its new hiding place, then secured it inside his coat. Later, as Eleanor and Abigail slept, Jackson remained awake, watching the darkness beyond the windows. The thaw had continued throughout the day, and a light fog now hung over the landscape, shrouding the trees in ghostly white. In that mist, enemies could approach unseen, but it would also cover his departure in the morning, providing a measure of protection as he set out for the way station. Jackson leaned back in his chair, rifle across his lap, and prepared for another night of watchfulness. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. For now, his duty was to guard the sleeping figures who had, against all odds, come to depend on him. In the silence of the cabin, with only the occasional pop from the fire to break the stillness, Jackson found himself remembering Catherine's words from long ago. We're put on this earth to help each other through the hard times, Jack. That's the only thing that really matters. He had failed her, but perhaps in protecting Eleanor and Abigail, he could begin to make amends. Outside, a wolf howled in the distance, its cry echoing across the valley. Another answered from closer, by the sound haunting and beautiful in its wildness. Jackson listened, finding a strange comfort in their voices, creatures surviving, despite the harshness of their world, finding strength in their pack. He had been alone too long. Perhaps it was time to remember what it meant to be part of something larger than himself. Dawn broke with reluctant fingers of pale light, stretching across the snow-laden valley. Jackson stood on the cabin porch, testing the air. The temperature hovered just above freezing, warm enough to keep the snow soft and wet, making travel slow and exhausting. But there was no choice. The mail carrier would be at the way station today, and this might be their only chance to summon help. Behind him, Eleanor emerged from the cabin, Abigail's scarf clutched in her hands. "Take this," she said, offering it to him. "For luck." Jackson accepted the worn wool garment, noting the careful darning where it had been repaired. "I'll bring it back," he promised, tucking it inside his coat. Eleanor's eyes held a mixture of hope and fear. "Be careful. Vernon's men won't hesitate to shoot if they see you. I know these woods better than they do." Jackson checked his rifle one last time, then slung it across his back. "Remember what I told you. Bar the door, keep the revolver close, and use the cellar if necessary." "We will." She hesitated, then added softly, "Come back safely, Jackson." The simple words carried a weight that settled in his chest, a reminder that he was no longer responsible only for himself. People depended on him now. He nodded once, then turned and set off his long strides, carrying him quickly into the shelter of the trees. The forest was eerily quiet in the morning mist, the usual sounds of birds and small creatures muted by the lingering fog. Jackson moved with practiced stealth, avoiding the obvious trails where someone might lie in wait. The way station lay due east, a small outpost maintained by the territorial government for mail carriers and the occasional traveler. It wasn't much, just a rough cabin with basic supplies, but it represented their best hope for summoning aid. As he walked, Jackson's thoughts turned to Eleanor and Abigail. In less than a week, they had transformed his solitary existence, bringing both danger and an unexpected sense of purpose. He had forgotten what it felt like to be needed to have someone waiting for his return. The sensation was both comforting and terrifying. The fog began to lift as the sun climbed higher, revealing a landscape in the midst of change. Water dripped from tree branches, and patches of bare ground had begun to appear where the snow had melted away. Spring was making an early bid for dominance, though winter would not surrender its grip so easily. By tonight, the temperature would plummet again, freezing the meltwater into treacherous sheets of ice. Jackson maintained a steady pace, alert for any sign of Vernon's men. The scouting presence yesterday suggested they were close, perhaps camped within a few miles of the cabin. It was a race now. If he could reach the way station and send for Frank before Vernon mounted his attack, they might stand a chance. By mid-morning, Jackson had covered nearly 5 miles. The exertion warmed him despite the damp chill that hung in the air. He paused at the crest of a small ridge, using the vantage point to scan his surroundings. The valley stretched below him, a patchwork of white snow and dark evergreens. Nothing moved except the occasional fall of snow from overloaded branches. He was about to continue when a glint of light caught his eye, sunlight reflecting off something metallic in the distance. Jackson dropped to one knee, eyes narrowed as he focused on the source. There, nearly a mile away, near the base of the opposing ridge, was a thin column of smoke rising from among the trees, a campfire poorly concealed. Jackson retrieved his small spyglass from his pack, extending it to study the distant camp. The magnification revealed what he feared: horses tethered among the pines and the movements of at least 3 men. At this distance he couldn't make out their features, but their presence alone was confirmation. Vernon's men had established a base from which to launch their attack. The question was, how many were there in total? The scout from yesterday might be among them, or he could be elsewhere, perhaps tracking Jackson at this very moment. Jackson pocketed the spyglass and considered his options. He could continue to the way station as planned, but doing so would take him dangerously close to the enemy camp. Alternatively, he could return to warn Eleanor, but that would mean abandoning their best chance for reinforcements. A third option presented itself. He could approach the camp, assess their numbers and readiness, and perhaps gain valuable intelligence about their plans. It was risky, but knowledge of the enemy might prove crucial in the coming confrontation. Decision made. Jackson altered his course, moving parallel to the ridge to maintain the high ground while drawing closer to the camp. He advanced with extreme caution, placing each foot deliberately to avoid snapping twigs or disturbing the melting snow. As he neared the camp, voices carried on the still air, men talking unaware of his presence. Jackson crouched behind the broad trunk of a fallen pine, close enough now to observe without being seen. He counted 4 men, all armed, gathered around a small fire. Their horses, 5 in total, suggested at least one more man was unaccounted for, likely the scout. Jackson studied each face carefully, committing them to memory. None was Vernon Reed, at least not based on Eleanor's description of a tall, broad-shouldered man with a prominent scar across one cheek. "Should have hit the cabin at first light," one of the men was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet forest. "Reed's going to be furious when he gets here and finds out we've been sitting on our hands." "And what would you have us do, Matthews?" another replied. "There's a man in there with a rifle in case you forgot. Jeffer said he saw him leave with the girl yesterday, checking traps. You want to end up shot because you were impatient. I'm saying Reed's paying us good money to get the woman and the kid, not to sit around with our thumbs up our—" "Reed said wait for him," the third man interrupted, older than the others, with a gray beard and an air of authority. "So we wait. He'll be here by nightfall and then we move. Until then, we stick to the plan. Watch the cabin, track their movements, but don't engage." Jackson's blood ran cold. Vernon Reed would arrive tonight, and then they would attack in force. There was even less time than he'd thought. He was about to retreat when a twig snapped behind him. Jackson froze, every muscle tensing as he sensed rather than saw someone approaching from his rear. "Found something interesting, boys," a voice called out, far too close. Jackson dove to his left as a shot rang out, the bullet splintering the log where he had been crouched just moments before. He rolled to his feet, rifle already swinging toward the threat, a bearded man in a heavy coat, frantically trying to reload his pistol. There was no time for hesitation. Jackson fired the rifle's report echoing across the valley as the scout staggered backward, clutching his chest. He fell without a sound, his body crumpling into the snow. Shouts erupted from the camp below as the other men grabbed their weapons. Jackson turned and ran, using the trees for cover as bullets whizzed past him. He had the advantage of higher ground and better knowledge of the terrain, but they had numbers. He sprinted through the forest, changing direction frequently to confuse pursuers, his breath coming in controlled bursts despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The plan for the way station was now impossible. He needed to return to the cabin immediately and prepare for the coming attack. Behind him, he could hear the men crashing through the underbrush, calling to each other as they spread out in pursuit. Jackson slowed only long enough to reload his rifle, then continued his strategic retreat, gradually angling back toward his cabin, while maintaining enough distance to avoid leading them directly to Eleanor and Abigail. For over an hour, he played a deadly game of cat and mouse among the trees, sometimes doubling back to confuse his trail, other times moving through small streams where the water had broken through the ice, leaving no footprints to follow. Gradually, the sounds of pursuit faded, though Jackson knew they hadn't given up. They had simply fallen too far behind to maintain contact. By early afternoon, he approached his cabin from the north, circling wide to ensure he hadn't been followed. The small clearing appeared undisturbed, with smoke rising steadily from the chimney. He studied the surroundings carefully before emerging from the tree line, alert for any sign of ambush. "Eleanor," he called softly as he reached the porch. "It's Jackson." The door opened immediately, revealing Eleanor, with the revolver held ready. Relief washed over her face when she saw him. "You're back early," she said quickly, ushering him inside and barring the door. "What happened? You're bleeding." Jackson touched his cheek, surprised to find a streak of blood where a branch had caught him during his flight. "They're closer than we thought, camped about 6 miles from here." Abigail rushed forward from her place by the fire. "Did they hurt you? Did they shoot at you?" Jackson knelt to her level, his expression gentle despite the urgency of their situation. "I'm fine, just a scratch from running through the trees." He rose, turning to Eleanor. "Vernon will be joining his men tonight. They plan to attack after he arrives." Eleanor paled, her hand tightening on the revolver. "How many?" "I counted 4 in the camp, plus a scout." Jackson's jaw tightened. "The scout won't be a problem anymore, but that still leaves 4 men plus Vernon when he arrives." "You killed him?" Eleanor asked not a question, but a realization. Jackson met her gaze steadily. "He shot at me first. I did what was necessary." She nodded once, accepting his answer, without judgment. "What now? We can't reach your friend the sheriff." "We prepare." Jackson moved to the storage room, retrieving boxes of ammunition and additional weapons, a shotgun, and an old army revolver. "Vernon and his men will come tonight or tomorrow at the latest. We need to be ready." As Jackson laid out his strategy, Abigail sat quietly by the fire, her small face as she listened to the adults discuss the coming violence. Eleanor noticed her daughter's distress and sent her to sort through the dried herbs hanging from the rafters, a task that would keep her occupied while they spoke. "Vernon won't be easily deterred," Eleanor warned, her voice low. "He's obsessed with finding that will, and he hates losing. He always has since he was a boy, according to Harold." "Men like that are predictable," Jackson replied, checking the action on the shotgun. "They mistake cruelty for strength. It makes them careless." "Not Vernon. He's calculating. That's what makes him dangerous." Eleanor hesitated, then added, "There's something else you should know. Something I haven't told you." Jackson paused in his preparations, giving her his full attention. "Abigail isn't my daughter by blood," she said softly, glancing to ensure the girl couldn't hear. "She's my sister's child. Lily died in childbirth, and I took Abigail as my own. Harold knew he loved her like his own daughter, but Vernon discovered the truth after Harold's death. He found my sister's letters." "Why does that matter to Vernon?" Jackson asked. "Because Harold's will specifies that his estate goes to his beloved daughter Abigail. If Abigail isn't his biological child, Vernon could contest the will, claim the inheritance for himself as Harold's only living blood relative." Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap. "That's why he's so determined to find us. The paper you're carrying doesn't just lead to Harold's real will, it leads to adoption papers. Harold filed in Boston, legally making Abigail his daughter in every sense. Without those papers, Vernon could win in court." The revelation added another layer to the conflict, not just a matter of controlling an inheritance, but of erasing a dead man's wishes for his chosen daughter. It made Vernon's pursuit even more comprehensible and more despicable. "Does Abigail know?" Jackson asked. Eleanor shook her head. "I've never told her. I planned to when she was older, but then Harold died, and everything fell apart." Her eyes filled with tears. "She's my daughter, in every way that matters. I've raised her since she was a newborn." "She is your daughter," Jackson agreed firmly. "And this doesn't change anything about our situation. We still need to hold Vernon off until help can arrive." They spent the remainder of the daylight hours preparing the cabin for defense. Jackson showed Eleanor how to reload the revolver quickly and where to position herself for maximum protection. He moved furniture to create additional barriers and filled buckets with water in case fire became a threat. Outside, he set simple alarms cans containing small stones hung from nearly invisible threads stretched across likely approaches. The noise would alert them to anyone approaching in the darkness. As dusk approached, Jackson took Abigail aside for a private conversation, while Eleanor prepared a meal from their dwindling supplies. "I have an important job for you," he told the girl, his tone serious but kind. "If bad men come tonight, you need to help your mother get to the cellar. Can you do that?" Abigail nodded solemnly. "Yes, sir." "Good. And once you're there, you need to stay quiet no matter what you hear, like a mouse hiding from a cat. Can you be that quiet?" "I can," she promised. "But what about you? Aren't you coming to hide too?" Jackson smiled gently. "My job is to make sure you and your mother are safe. I'll join you when I can." The child seemed to understand the implicit meaning that he might not join them at all. Her small hand reached out to touch his arm. "Please be careful, Mr. Thornhill. I don't want you to get hurt because of us." The simple sincerity of her concern touched something deep within Jackson, a place he'd thought long since walled off. "I'll be careful," he promised. "Now go help your mother with dinner. We need to keep up our strength." They ate in relative silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Jackson maintained a watchful eye on the windows, though he knew Vernon was unlikely to arrive before full dark. Eleanor moved with nervous energy, repeatedly checking that the revolver was within easy reach. As they cleared away the meal, Jackson noted that Abigail had barely touched her food. "You need to eat," he told her gently, "to keep up your strength." "I'm not hungry," she replied, her voice small. Eleanor knelt beside her daughter. "Abby, sweetheart, I know you're scared, but Mr. Thornhill is right. You need to eat something." The girl looked between them, her eyes welling with tears. "Are we going to die?" The blunt question hung in the air. Jackson and Eleanor exchanged a glance, wordless communication passing between them. "No," Jackson said firmly. "We are not going to die. I won't let that happen." "But the bad men have guns," Abigail persisted, "and there are more of them than us." "Numbers aren't everything," Jackson told her, sitting down so they were eye to eye. "I have something they don't have." "What's that? Something worth fighting for?" He looked at Eleanor as he said it, and something passed between them, an unspoken understanding that transcended their brief acquaintance. Eleanor's cheeks flushed slightly, but she didn't look away. "Abby, remember what I told you about David and Goliath. Sometimes the smaller fighter wins because they're smarter or braver or because they're fighting for what's right." Abigail nodded slowly, then picked up her spoon and took a small bite of the stew. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As full darkness settled over the cabin, Jackson extinguished all lamps, except one small candle burning in the back room away from the windows. The darkness would preserve their night vision and make it harder for attackers to pinpoint their positions inside. "Try to rest," he told Eleanor and Abigail. "I'll keep watch. If anything happens, I'll wake you immediately." Eleanor helped Abigail settle on the bearskin rug by the fire, wrapping her in blankets and singing softly until the child's eyes grew heavy with sleep. Then she joined Jackson by the window, her face ghostly in the faint light reflecting off the snow outside. "You should rest, too," he said quietly. "I couldn't sleep if I tried." She stared out at the dark landscape. "It's strange. I've been afraid for so long that it almost feels normal now, but this is different. Tonight it ends one way or another." Jackson understood. The anticipation of violence carried its own peculiar tension, a state of heightened awareness that was both exhausting and impossible to relinquish. "If we don't survive this..." Eleanor began, her voice barely above a whisper. "We will," Jackson interrupted. "But if we don't," she persisted, "I want you to know that these days in your cabin have been the first time I felt safe since Harold died. You've shown Abigail and me a kindness we had forgotten existed." She turned to face him fully. "Whatever happens, I want to thank you for that." Jackson felt uncomfortable under the weight of her gratitude. "You would have done the same for me," he said simply. "Would I?" Eleanor's lips curved in a sad smile. "I'm not so sure. Fear makes cowards of most people. I've seen it neighbors who looked the other way when Vernon paraded me through town with my head-shaved friends who closed their doors rather than risk his displeasure. That's their shame to carry, not yours." "Perhaps." She gazed out at the night again. "What will you do, Jackson, after this is over? I mean—" The question caught him off guard. He had been so focused on their immediate survival that he hadn't considered what would come after. For 7 years, his life had followed the same solitary pattern, hunting, trapping, existing, rather than living. The idea of a future beyond that seemed almost impossible to contemplate. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I haven't thought that far ahead." "Nor have I," Eleanor said softly. "But I find myself wanting to for the first time in a long while." Before Jackson could respond, a metallic rattling shattered the silence, one of his alarm cans triggered by movement at the edge of the clearing. "They're here," he said, instantly alert. "Wake Abigail. Get ready to move to the cellar if I give the word." Eleanor nodded, her momentary vulnerability replaced by determined focus as she moved to rouse her daughter. Jackson positioned himself by the window rifle ready, watching for movement in the darkness. The battle for their lives was about to begin. For several long minutes, nothing happened. The night remained still, with only the occasional gust of wind disturbing the branches of the nearby pines. Then Jackson caught a flicker of movement, a shadow detaching itself from the tree line, followed by another. They were being cautious, approaching from multiple directions, using the trees for cover. Jackson counted 3 figures moving through the darkness, which meant at least 2 others were positioned elsewhere, possibly circling to the rear of the cabin. The crack of a rifle shot confirmed his suspicion. A bullet splintered the window frame inches from his head, fired from behind the cabin. Jackson ducked down, motioning for Eleanor to stay low. "Thornhill," a voice called from the darkness. "We know you're in there. Send out the woman and the girl, and we'll let you live." Jackson didn't respond, knowing that engaging would only help them pinpoint his position. Instead, he moved silently to another window, watching as the shadows drew closer to the cabin. "Last chance, Thornhill," the voice called again. "Reed's offering $50 for you to walk away. That's good money for a few minutes' work." When Jackson remained silent, a new barrage of gunfire erupted, bullets thudding into the thick log walls of the cabin. Eleanor clutched Abigail close, both huddled behind an overturned table for protection. Jackson waited for a pause in the shooting, then fired twice in rapid succession. A cry of pain told him at least one shot had found its mark. The attackers fell back, retreating to the cover of the trees. "You hit one?" someone called. "Grazed my arm," came the reply. "Bastard can shoot, I'll give him that." Jackson used the reprieve to move to Eleanor and Abigail. "They're testing our defenses," he explained quietly, "trying to draw us out or get us to waste ammunition. They'll try something else soon." As if on cue, a flaming arrow arced through the air, landing on the cabin roof with a soft thud. A second and third followed their fiery trails, illuminating the night like fallen stars. "Fire!" Eleanor gasped. "They're trying to burn us out." Jackson grabbed the water buckets he'd prepared earlier. "The roof's still wet from the thaw. It won't catch easily, but we need to be ready." A fourth arrow struck the porch, the flames catching on the wooden planks. Jackson flung open the door just long enough to douse the fire bullets, kicking up splinters around his feet as he did so. "Eleanor," he said urgently as he closed the door again. "Take Abigail to the cellar now. They'll keep trying to burn the cabin. It's not safe up here." She hesitated, clearly torn between obeying and staying to help. "What about you?" "I'll hold them off as long as I can. Frank checks the way station every Thursday. When he doesn't find me there, he'll come looking. We just need to last until then. And if the cabin burns around you," Jackson's expression was grim, "I'll retreat to the cellar before that happens. Now go, please." Eleanor gathered Abigail in her arms. "Remember your promise," she said fiercely. "You said we wouldn't die tonight." "And I meant it," he replied. "Go." As Eleanor led Abigail to the storage room and the hidden cellar beneath Jackson, returned to the window. The fire arrows had illuminated the attacker's positions, giving him a momentary advantage. He spotted a figure moving between trees and fired. The man dropped through whether dead or merely wounded, Jackson couldn't tell. More arrows came, most missing the cabin entirely in the attacker's haste. Those that landed on the roof sizzled in the dampness before going out. But Jackson knew it was only a matter of time before something caught. The wood would eventually dry from the heat, becoming more susceptible to the flames. A new voice called from the darkness, different from the one before, deeper, more authoritative. "Thornhill, this is Vernon Reed. I know you have my sister-in-law and niece in there. They don't belong to you." So Reed had arrived just as his men had predicted. Jackson remained silent, conserving ammunition and refusing to reveal his position. "I'm a reasonable man, Thornhill." Reed continued, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of a successful businessman. "I understand Eleanor may have poisoned your mind against me with her lies. She's been unwell since my dear brother's death, you see. All I want is to take her home, get her the care she needs." The lies were smooth, practiced, the words of a man accustomed to manipulating others. Jackson wondered how many people had believed Reed's concerned act. How many had turned a blind eye to his cruelty because he presented such a reasonable facade. "The girl needs a proper family, a proper upbringing," Reed called. "Surely you can see that a child shouldn't be raised in a situation like this, trapped in a cabin with a stranger, a man with no ties to her. What would people think?" When Jackson still didn't respond, Reed's tone hardened. "Have it your way. But know this, that cabin will burn with or without you in it, and I will take what's mine." A new volley of fire arrows followed, more concentrated this time. One lodged in the eave of the cabin, the flames catching in the dry wood beneath the roofline. Jackson cursed under his breath. He would need to extinguish it quickly, but doing so meant exposing himself to gunfire. There was no choice. He grabbed a bucket of water and a long pole he kept by the door for knocking snow from the roof. Taking a deep breath, he flung open the door and used the pole to dislodge the burning arrow, then doused the flames with water. Bullets whizzed around him, one grazing his arm in a line of fire. Jackson slammed the door shut and pressed his back against it, breathing hard. The wound wasn't serious, just a deep scratch that bled freely, but it confirmed what he already knew. Reed and his men were tightening the noose, and his options were dwindling. He reloaded his rifle, ignoring the burning in his arm. Outside, the attackers were growing bolder, moving closer to the cabin under cover of darkness. Jackson counted at least 4 distinct figures, now including the tall man, who could only be Vernon Reed. A crash from the rear of the cabin drew his attention. They were trying to break in through the storage room window. Jackson moved swiftly, firing through the small window before anyone could climb through. A howl of pain rewarded his vigilance. "Matthews is hit bad," someone shouted. "I don't care." Reed's voice was cold with fury. "There's one of him and 5 of us. I want that cabin taken now." Jackson checked his ammunition. He had perhaps 20 rounds left for the rifle, 12 for the shotgun, and 6 each in the revolvers. It would have to be enough. The attack intensified with gunfire from multiple directions, keeping Jackson pinned down, while others attempted to set the cabin ablaze. He moved from window to window, firing when he had a clear shot, conserving bullets when he didn't. Another arrow found purchase in the roof, and this time the flames spread slowly along the dry wood of the eave. Smoke began to fill the cabin, acrid and choking. Jackson pulled his bandana over his nose and mouth, but his eyes stung and watered. He needed to get to the cellar soon before the smoke overcame him. A sudden crash signaled a new threat. Someone had thrown a burning branch through one of the windows, sending glass and flames onto the cabin floor. Jackson stamped out the fire, but in doing so left himself exposed. A bullet tore through his leg, the impact spinning him around and dropping him to one knee. Pain exploded through his thigh, hot and immediate. Jackson gritted his teeth against the cry that threatened to escape. He couldn't show weakness now. Using the wall for support, he dragged himself back to his feet, ignoring the blood soaking his trousers. The smoke was thicker now, making it difficult to see. The roof was burning in earnest small flames, visible through cracks in the ceiling. Jackson knew he had minutes at most before the entire structure became a death trap. It was time to retreat to the cellar. Gathering the remaining ammunition and a canteen of water, Jackson limped toward the storage room. Every step sent waves of agony through his injured leg, but he forced himself forward. He had promised Eleanor and Abigail they would survive this night, and he intended to keep that promise. The storage room was hazy with smoke, but cooler than the main cabin. Jackson shifted the shelving unit that concealed the trap door, his injured leg nearly buckling under the strain. He lifted the heavy wooden door and lowered himself awkwardly into the darkness below. "Eleanor," he called softly. "It's Jackson." "Here," came her immediate response. A match flared, illuminating her face in the small space. She gasped when she saw him. "You're hurt." "Not badly," he lied, closing the trap door above them. "The cabin's burning. We need to stay down here until it's safe to leave." The cellar was little more than a dugout beneath the cabin, a space about 8 feet square, reinforced with timber supports and lined with shelves holding preserved food and supplies. The ceiling was low, forcing Jackson to hunch uncomfortably as Eleanor helped him to a rough bench along one wall. Abigail was huddled in the corner, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes widening at the sight of Jackson's blood-soaked trousers. "You got shot," she said, her voice small with fear. "Just a scratch," Jackson assured her, though the throbbing pain suggested otherwise. "Nothing to worry about." Eleanor lit a small oil lamp, keeping the flame low to conserve air. In its dim light, she examined Jackson's leg. The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of his thigh, missing the bone, but leaving a nasty wound that continued to bleed steadily. "This needs to be bandaged," she said, tearing strips from the hem of her dress. "Abby, bring me the water canteen and that small medicine bag from the shelf." As Abigail hurried to obey, Eleanor worked quickly to clean and bind the wound. Above them, they could hear the fire consuming the cabin, the crack and groan of burning timbers, the occasional crash as a section of roof collapsed. "They think we're still inside," Jackson said, wincing as Eleanor tightened the bandage. "That gives us an advantage." "What advantage?" Eleanor asked, her voice tight with tension. "We're trapped under a burning building and you're wounded." "But they don't know about this cellar. Once they believe we're dead, they'll leave. Then we can escape through the tunnel." Eleanor paused in her ministrations. "What tunnel?" Jackson managed a grim smile despite the pain. "Did you think I'd build a hiding place without an exit?" He nodded toward the darkest corner of the cellar. "Behind those barrels. It leads out to the stream bank about 50 yards from the cabin. I dug it after Catherine died. Wanted to make sure I always had a way out if raiders came again. Relief flooded Eleanor's face. So we can escape while they're watching the cabin burn. Once they believe we're dead, yes. But we need to be patient. Reed won't leave until he's certain. As if to confirm his words, Vernon Reed's voice carried to them faintly through the burning structure above. Keep watching. Make sure none of them escape. I want to see bodies when this is over. Eleanor shuddered at the hatred in that voice. He won't stop, will he? Even if he thinks we're dead, he'll search the ashes. Probably, Jackson agreed. But by then we'll be long gone. He shifted, trying to find a more comfortable position for his injured leg. There's a small cave about 2 miles downstream. We can shelter there until it's safe to move on. Abigail had been listening silently, her eyes moving between the adults. Now she spoke, her voice surprisingly steady. What about your friend the sheriff? Won't he come to help us? He will, Jackson assured her. But it might take a day or two. We need to stay hidden until then. The cellar grew warmer as the fire intensified above them, the heat seeping through the earth and ceiling, despite the layer of insulation Jackson had installed. Sweat beaded on their faces, but the alternative, opening the trap door, would mean certain death from smoke inhalation. Time stretched endlessly in the close confines of the cellar. Abigail eventually fell into an uneasy sleep, her head resting against Eleanor's shoulder. Eleanor remained awake, her attention divided between the sleeping child and Jackson, whose face had grown pale with pain and blood loss. How bad is it really? She asked softly, nodding toward his leg. I've had worse, Jackson replied, though the wound was beginning to throb alarmingly, and he suspected infection would set in if it wasn't properly treated soon. I'll make it to the cave. Eleanor's eyes held doubt, but she didn't contradict him. Tell me about this cave. Is it safe? Safe enough. Dry, hidden from view. I've used it before when hunting trips ran longer than expected. Jackson shifted again, trying to ease the pressure on his injury. There's a natural spring inside, and I keep some emergency supplies there. You think of everything, Eleanor observed. Not everything. I didn't foresee Vernon Reed. Jackson's mouth twisted in what might have been a smile under different circumstances. But I've learned to prepare for the unexpected. Above them, the sounds of the fire had changed, less crackling, more the hollow groaning of a structure in its death throes. Occasionally they heard voices, as Reed's men called to each other, but the words were indistinct. They're still watching, Jackson said, waiting for us to try to escape the flames. How long will they wait? Until morning, probably. Reed won't leave until he's certain. Jackson checked the chamber of his revolver, ensuring it was fully loaded. But we don't need to wait that long. Once the main structure collapses, they'll assume we're dead, and we can slip away through the tunnel. Eleanor nodded her arm, tightening protectively around Abigail. And then what? Where do we go from here? The question hung between them, laden with implications beyond their immediate survival. Jackson found himself without a ready answer. For 7 years he had lived day to day, expecting nothing beyond the next sunrise. The idea of planning a future, of considering what came after, was foreign territory. First we survive, he said finally. Then we find Frank and deal with Reed. After that, he paused, studying Eleanor's face in the dim light. After that, I suppose you'll want to go to Boston to find that lawyer and secure Abigail's inheritance. Yes, Eleanor agreed. But what about you? Before Jackson could respond, a tremendous crash shook the cellar as a major portion of the cabin collapsed above them. Dust and debris sifted through cracks in the ceiling, and Abigail woke with a startled cry. It's all right. Eleanor soothed, hugging her daughter close. "We're safe down here." Jackson listened intently. The collapse had been followed by shouts of triumph from Reed's men. They believed their objective had been achieved. "The cabin's gone," a voice called. "Nothing could have survived that." "Search the ruins," came Reed's reply, closer now. "I want to see their bodies." "Are you crazy? That place is still an inferno. We'll check in the morning when it's cooled down." A pause, then Reed's reluctant agreement. "Fine, but we camp here tonight. No one leaves until I've seen proof they're dead." Jackson met Eleanor's gaze across the dim cellar. "Now we wait," he said quietly. "Let them settle in for the night. Then we make our move." Hours passed in tense silence. The heat gradually dissipated as the fire burned itself out, leaving the cellar in darkness when they extinguished the lamp to conserve oil. Jackson fought against the pain and weakness in his leg, knowing that the coming escape would demand every ounce of his remaining strength. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, when the voices above had fallen silent, except for the murmur of a single watchman, Jackson decided it was time. "Eleanor," he whispered, touching her arm gently. "Wake up. It's time to go." She stirred immediately, having only dozed lightly. "Now?" "Yes. They posted one guard. The others are sleeping. This is our best chance." Jackson shifted to the corner of the cellar, wincing as his injured leg protested the movement. "Help me with these barrels." Together they moved the heavy water barrels that concealed the entrance to the escape tunnel. Behind them was a narrow opening barely large enough for an adult to crawl through on hands and knees. "Abigail goes first," Jackson instructed. "Then you, then me. The tunnel is about 30 yards long and it comes out under a fallen log near the stream. Once you're out, stay hidden until I join you." Eleanor woke Abigail gently, explaining in hushed tones what they needed to do. The child, still half asleep, nodded her understanding. "Like a secret passage in a castle," she whispered. "Exactly like that." Jackson agreed, grateful for her resilience. "Can you be brave and lead the way?" Abigail nodded solemnly. "I can be brave." Jackson showed her the entrance, explaining how to navigate the narrow space. "Follow the tunnel until you see light. It's very dark, but there's only one way to go, so you can't get lost." With a last determined look at her mother, Abigail crawled into the tunnel and disappeared from view. Eleanor followed moments later, casting a worried glance at Jackson, before she too vanished into the darkness. Alone in the cellar, Jackson gathered their few remaining supplies: the revolver ammunition, a canteen of water, and a small bundle of food. Moving was agony, his wounded leg stiff and throbbing. The bandage Eleanor had applied was soaked through with fresh blood, but there was no time to change it now. With a deep breath, Jackson lowered himself into the tunnel entrance, dragging his injured leg behind him. The space was even tighter than he remembered the earthen walls, pressing in on all sides as he crawled forward on elbows and one good knee. Progress was slow and painful. Every movement sent fresh waves of agony through his leg, and the exertion soon had him sweating despite the cool air in the tunnel. But he pressed on, driven by the knowledge that Eleanor and Abigail were waiting for him, depending on him to guide them to safety. The tunnel seemed endless, stretching before him in absolute darkness. Had it always been this long? Jackson fought against disorientation, focusing on moving forward inch by agonizing inch. Finally, he saw it, a faint lightening in the darkness ahead. The exit was near. With renewed determination, Jackson crawled the final yards, emerging at last beneath the hollow of a fallen pine log, just as he had described. Eleanor was waiting, her face tight with worry. "You made it," she whispered, relief evident in her voice. "I was about to come back for you." "I told you I would," Jackson replied, though his voice was strained with pain. "Where's Abigail?" "Here," came a small voice from behind a nearby tree. The girl peeked out, then rushed to Jackson's side when she saw him emerge. "Are you all right? You took so long." "Just moving carefully," he assured her, not wanting to worry her with the truth that his strength was failing rapidly and the wound in his leg was far worse than he'd let on. Eleanor helped him to his feet, supporting his weight as best she could. "Which way to the cave?" she asked. Jackson oriented himself, noting the position of the stars visible through breaks in the clouds. "Downstream. Follow the creek east for about 2 miles. There's a stand of 3 large boulders on the north bank. The cave entrance is behind them, hidden by brush." They moved cautiously through the forest, staying close to the stream, but keeping to the shadows of the trees. Above and behind them, the remains of the cabin glowed with lingering embers, casting an eerie red light over the clearing. A solitary figure, the watchman was visible pacing near what had been the front porch. "He hasn't noticed we're gone," Eleanor whispered. "They really believe we died in the fire." "Let's keep it that way," Jackson responded. "Move quietly and stay low." The journey to the cave was grueling. Jackson's injured leg threatened to give out with each step, and only Eleanor's support kept him moving forward. Abigail walked ahead of them, scouting the path as Jackson had taught her, her small form almost ghostly in the pre-dawn light. By the time they reached the 3 boulders Jackson had described, the eastern sky had begun to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Jackson was feverish, his face slick with sweat despite the cold air. "Here," he managed, indicating a dense growth of brush against the rock face. "Behind there?" Eleanor pushed aside the branches, revealing a narrow opening little more than a crack in the stone, but wide enough for them to squeeze through one at a time. "Abigail, you first," she directed. "Then we'll help Mr. Thornhill." The cave beyond the entrance was larger than it appeared from outside a natural chamber about 15 feet across, with a ceiling just high enough for an adult to stand upright. As Jackson had promised, a small spring bubbled up from the rock at the rear, providing fresh water. Against one wall stood a crude shelf, holding several tins of food matches and a rolled blanket, Jackson's emergency cache. "Help me sit," Jackson said, his voice rough with pain. Eleanor guided him to a relatively flat rock, where he sank down with a barely suppressed groan. In the growing light filtering through the cave entrance, Eleanor got her first clear look at his condition. Jackson's face was ashen, his eyes bright with fever. The bandage on his leg was soaked through with blood, and the wound beneath had begun to show signs of infection, the skin around it red and swollen. "This is bad," she said carefully, unwrapping the sodden cloth. "You need a doctor." "Not an option right now," Jackson replied. "There are supplies here, whiskey for disinfection, willow bark for the fever." Eleanor sent Abigail to fetch water from the spring, while she examined the contents of Jackson's emergency stores. She found a small flask of whiskey, a packet of dried herbs she assumed was the willow bark he'd mentioned, and clean cloth that could serve as bandages. "This is going to hurt," she warned, as she prepared to clean the wound. Jackson's mouth quirked in a pained smile. "I figured that." He gripped the edge of the rock beneath him as Eleanor poured whiskey over the entry and exit wounds. His entire body went rigid with pain, but he made no sound other than a sharp intake of breath. Abigail watched with wide, frightened eyes as Eleanor worked cleaning away dried blood and applying a paste of herbs to the angry wounds before binding them with fresh bandages. "Will he die?" the child whispered, when Eleanor finally sat back, her hands bloody from her efforts. "No," Jackson answered before Eleanor could respond. "I promised we wouldn't die, remember, and I keep my promises." But his voice lacked conviction, and Eleanor could see the fever taking hold, burning him from within, as infection spread through his system. Without proper medical attention, Jackson's chances were grim. "You need to rest," she told him, helping him lie down on the blanket she'd spread over the cave floor. "Save your strength." Jackson didn't argue a sign of how truly ill he was feeling. He allowed Eleanor to position him on the makeshift bed, his eyes already closing as exhaustion claimed him. Once he was settled, Eleanor led Abigail to the cave entrance, where they could speak without disturbing him. "Is Mr. Thornhill going to die, Mama?" Abigail asked again, her voice small and frightened. Eleanor crouched to her daughter's level, meeting her eyes directly. "I don't know, sweetheart. He's very sick, and his wound is infected, but he's strong and he's fighting hard. Because of us," the child said, her face solemn with understanding beyond her years. "He got hurt because he was protecting us." "Yes," Eleanor agreed softly. "Because of us." Abigail looked past her mother to the still form of the man who had risked everything for them, a stranger who had become their protector, their friend, perhaps something more. "Then we have to save him," she declared with simple certainty. "Like he saved us." Eleanor hugged her daughter close, drawing strength from the child's unwavering conviction. "Yes," she whispered into Abigail's hair. "We do." Outside, the dawn broke fully over the Montana wilderness, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. A new day had begun, bringing with it both danger and hope. Vernon Reed still hunted them, believing them dead, but determined to confirm it. Jackson's friend, the sheriff, might be searching for them, or might not yet know they needed help. And in a hidden cave by a frozen stream, a wounded man fought for his life, while a woman and child watched over him, determined that his sacrifice would not be in vain. Eleanor settled Abigail with a small breakfast from their supplies, then returned to Jackson's side. His breathing had grown labored, his skin hot to the touch, despite the cave's cool air. She dampened a cloth in the spring water and placed it on his forehead, hoping to bring down the fever. "Jackson," she called softly, unsure if he could hear her. "Jackson, you need to fight. Abigail and I need you." His eyelids fluttered, then opened halfway. "Eleanor." His voice was a rasp, barely audible. "I'm here," she assured him, taking his hand in hers. "Rest now. Save your strength." "If I don't make it," he began. "Don't," she interrupted. "Don't say that. Listen." He insisted, his grip tightening on her hand with surprising strength. "If I don't make it, take the southern trail from here. Follow the stream until you reach a fork, then go east. 2 days' walk will bring you to Clearwater. Ask for Frank Sullivan. Tell him Jackson sent you." Eleanor nodded, tears filling her eyes despite her efforts to remain strong. "I will, but it won't come to that. You're going to get through this." Jackson's eyes closed again, the brief moment of clarity fading as fever reclaimed him. Eleanor continued to bathe his face with cool water, watching helplessly as his condition deteriorated. Outside, the day brightened toward noon. Eleanor ventured to the cave entrance, occasionally checking for any sign of pursuit, but the forest remained quiet. Vernon Reed and his men were likely still at the cabin site, searching the ashes for bodies they would never find. How long before they realized the truth? How long before they began searching the surrounding area? These questions haunted Eleanor as she tended to Jackson and tried to keep Abigail's spirits up. The child had been remarkably resilient throughout their ordeal, but even she had limits. By mid-afternoon, she had grown restless in the confines of the cave, asking repeatedly when Jackson would wake up, when they could leave, whether the bad men were still looking for them. "I want to help," she said finally, her small face determined. "Like you're helping Mr. Thornhill. What can I do?" Eleanor considered the question. Giving Abigail a task would keep her occupied and might genuinely be useful. You can watch for anyone coming, she decided, but stay hidden and come back immediately if you see anything. Abigail nodded solemnly, accepting the responsibility with pride. I'll be careful, Mama. I promise. Eleanor positioned her near the cave entrance behind a screen of brush where she could observe the surrounding forest without being seen. Then she returned to Jackson, whose condition continued to worsen. His skin burned with fever, and his breathing had grown shallow and rapid. Eleanor prepared more willow bark tea, forcing small sips between his lips when he was lucid enough to swallow. It wasn't enough. Without real medicine, without a doctor, Jackson's chances diminished with each passing hour. By late afternoon, Eleanor had nearly given up hope. Jackson had slipped into unconsciousness, his breathing erratic, his pulse weak and thready beneath her fingertips. She sat beside him, holding his hand, tears streaming silently down her face. You saved us, she told him, though she wasn't sure he could hear. You gave us shelter when no one else would. You stood against Vernon when others looked away. She swallowed hard. You made me believe in goodness again, Jackson, and the possibility of a future. Don't leave us now. Please. A sound from the cave entrance startled her. Abigail, running back from her lookout position, eyes wide with excitement rather than fear. Mama, she whispered urgently. There are men coming, but they're wearing stars like in the stories. Hope surged through Eleanor. Stars like sheriffs. Abigail nodded vigorously. 3 of them, and they're calling Mr. Thornhill's name. Eleanor rose shakily to her feet. Stay with Mr. Thornhill, she instructed. I'll go see. She moved cautiously to the cave entrance, peering through the concealing brush. Sure enough, 3 men on horseback were moving slowly along the stream, looking carefully at the ground, as if following a trail. All wore the distinctive badges of lawmen. For a moment, Eleanor hesitated. What if it was a trick? What if Vernon Reed had somehow convinced local authorities to help him search for them? But one of the men called out again, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. Jackson Thornhill. It's Frank Sullivan. Where are you, you stubborn bastard? The genuine concern in the man's voice decided her. Eleanor stepped from the cave entrance, waving her arms to attract their attention. Here, she called. Please, we need help. Jackson's been shot. The men wheeled their horses toward her, approaching rapidly. The lead rider, a broad-shouldered man with a thick mustache and weathered face, reached her first. Where is he? He demanded without preamble. In the cave, Eleanor replied, already turning back toward the entrance. He's very ill. Infections set in. Frank Sullivan dismounted in a fluid motion, signaling his deputies to follow. I'm Frank Sullivan, Sheriff of Clearwater County. He introduced himself as they hurried into the cave. Jackson and I served together in the war. I'm Eleanor Reed. Jackson took my daughter and me in when we were in trouble. She led them to where Jackson lay unconscious, Abigail kneeling anxiously beside him. Frank dropped to one knee, his expression grim, as he examined his friend. How long has he been like this? Since early this morning. He was shot last night during the attack. Eleanor explained quickly about Vernon Reed, the burning cabin, and their escape through the tunnel. Vernon Reed, Frank repeated, his jaw tightening. I know him. Businessman from over in Pinesdale. Got a reputation for being hard on debtors. He looked up at Eleanor. You're saying he did this, burned Jackson's place, shot him? Yes. He's been pursuing us since we escaped his house. He's my brother-in-law, my husband's brother. Eleanor touched her shorn head self-consciously. He did this to me, and worse. Frank's eyes narrowed as he took in her appearance, understanding dawning on his weathered face. I see. Well, Mrs. Reed, you're safe now, and so is your daughter. He turned to one of his deputies. Miller, ride back to town. Get Doc Williams out here with a wagon. Tell him to bring everything he's got for treating infection." The deputy nodded and hurried out. "How did you find us?" Eleanor asked as Frank began examining Jackson's wound more closely. "Jackson didn't show up at the way station yesterday. The mail carrier told me he'd been expecting an important message from him." Frank's hands were gentle despite their size as he checked Jackson's pulse. "I knew something was wrong. Jackson's too reliable to miss an appointment like that without good reason." "So you came looking for him?" "Damn right I did. Found his cabin burned to the ground this morning with a bunch of men searching through the ashes." Frank's expression darkened. They claimed to be friends of Jackson's concerned when they saw the fire, but something didn't sit right. So I had my deputies detain them while I looked around. "Did you find Vernon?" Eleanor asked anxiously. "If he was one of the men there, yes, got 5 of them cooling their heels in my jail right now pending investigation." Frank sat back on his heels, his gaze returning to Jackson. "How long were you at his cabin?" "Nearly a week. He found us in an abandoned shed half frozen. Abigail led him to us after we escaped Vernon's house." Eleanor's voice caught. "He risked everything for us people he didn't even know." Frank nodded, unsurprised. "That sounds like Jackson. Always did have more courage than sense." His tone was gruff, but fond. "But he's also the toughest son of a—" He glanced at Abigail, correcting himself. "The toughest man I know. If anyone can pull through this, it's him." His words offered Eleanor a glimmer of hope she desperately needed. "Will your doctor be able to help him?" "Doc Williams is the best in the territory. Patched me up after a shootout that should have put me in the ground. If anyone can save Jackson, it's him." Frank stood his decision made. "We need to get him back to town. The sooner Doc can treat him properly, the better his chances." "Can he survive being moved?" Eleanor worried. "He won't survive if we leave him here," Frank replied bluntly. "The infection's spreading fast. He needs real medicine, not just herbs and whiskey." Eleanor nodded, accepting the harsh reality. The next few hours would determine whether Jackson Thornhill lived or died, and with his fate, the future of 2 souls who had found in him not just a protector, but perhaps the promise of something more. As they waited for the doctor's arrival, Eleanor knelt beside Jackson one more time, taking his burning hand in hers. "Hold on," she whispered. "Help is coming. You just have to hold on." In the growing twilight, Dr. Williams arrived with a wagon and 2 assistants, his medical bag clutched tightly in weathered hands. The physician was a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the brisk efficiency of someone who had seen too much suffering to waste time on pleasantries. "Let me see him," he said without preamble, kneeling beside Jackson's still form. His examination was thorough, but gentle, checking pulse temperature and the infected wound with practiced fingers. "Can you save him?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Possibly. The fever's dangerously high, and this infection—" He shook his head grimly. "We need to get him to my surgery immediately. Every minute counts." They transferred Jackson to the wagon with extreme care, Eleanor riding beside him, while Abigail sat up front with Frank. The journey back to Clearwater was a nightmare of jolting wheels and desperate prayers, Eleanor holding Jackson's burning hand as consciousness slipped further from his fevered mind. "Stay with us," she whispered again and again. "You promised, Jackson. You promised we wouldn't die." Dr. Williams worked through the night in his small clinic, Eleanor and Abigail waiting in the adjoining parlor as sounds of urgent medical intervention filtered through the thin walls. Frank paced like a caged wolf, his usual composure cracked by worry for his old war companion. "He's tough," Frank said for the 10th time more to convince himself than Eleanor. "Survived Gettysburg, survived losing Catherine. He'll pull through this too." Dawn was breaking when Dr. Williams finally emerged, exhaustion etched in every line of his face. Eleanor rose so quickly she nearly fainted, Abigail clutching her skirts. "He's alive," the doctor said, and Eleanor's knees nearly buckled with relief. "The fever broke an hour ago. I was able to clean out most of the infection, but it was touch and go for a while." He removed his spectacles, cleaning them with shaking hands. "Another few hours and we would have lost him." "Can we see him?" Abigail asked in a small voice. Dr. Williams smiled, the first genuine warmth he'd shown. "In a little while, child. He's still very weak, but yes, I think seeing you both will do him more good than any medicine I have." Over the following days, Jackson's recovery was slow but steady. Eleanor rarely left his bedside, feeding him broth when he was strong enough, reading aloud from books when he was not. Abigail appointed herself his guardian, bringing him flowers picked from the doctor's garden and regaling him with stories of their adventures in town. "You missed all the excitement," she told him one afternoon as he sat propped against pillows, color finally returning to his gaunt cheeks. "Sheriff Sullivan arrested Uncle Vernon and all his men. There's going to be a trial and everything." Jackson's eyes found Eleanor's over the child's head. "How are you holding up?" he asked softly. "Better now that you're awake," she admitted. "Frank says Vernon's hired a lawyer from Billings, but the evidence is overwhelming. The burned cabin, the bullet that matches their guns, my testimony." She touched her growing hair unconsciously. "He won't escape justice this time." And the trial, when it came, was swift and decisive. Vernon Reed's protests of innocence fell on deaf ears as witness after witness testified to his cruelty and greed. Eleanor's testimony was particularly damning, her calm recitation of months of abuse punctuated by the visible evidence of her shorn head and healing bruises. "The defendant will rise," Judge Morrison intoned when the jury returned their verdict. Vernon Reed stood with his lawyer, his face a mask of barely contained rage. "On the charge of attempted murder, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of arson, guilty. On the charge of kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment, guilty." The judge's gavel fell like thunder. "Vernon Reed, you are hereby sentenced to 20 years hard labor in the territorial prison. May God have mercy on your soul." As Vernon was led away in shackles, he turned one last time toward Eleanor, his eyes burning with undiminished hatred. "This isn't over," he hissed. "Blood will tell in the end." But his words held no power, now empty threats from a broken man whose reign of terror had finally ended. 3 months later, as summer reached its peak in the Montana Territory, a small wagon made its way along the familiar trail to Broken Fir Creek. Jackson handled the reins with practiced ease, his injured leg healed, though he would always carry a slight limp, as Dr. Williams had predicted. Beside him sat Eleanor, her hair now grown out in soft brown curls that caught the sunlight. She wore a simple blue dress, her wedding dress purchased with part of Abigail's inheritance after their successful journey to Boston. The adoption papers were safely filed, Harold's will properly probated, and Abigail's future secured beyond Vernon's reach. In the back of the wagon, surrounded by supplies and furniture, Abigail knelt excitedly, pointing out familiar landmarks. "Look, Mama, I mean Eleanor, there's the stream where Jackson taught me to fish." Eleanor smiled at her daughter's excitement, while Jackson chuckled at the child's continued struggle with calling them by their first names now that they were a proper family. "Just Jackson and Eleanor, now remember," Eleanor said gently. "We talked about this." "It's still strange," Abigail admitted. "But I like it. It makes us feel like we all belong together." "We do belong together," Jackson said firmly, reaching over to squeeze Eleanor's hand. "In every way that matters." As they crested the final hill, the clearing came into view. Where Jackson's cabin had once stood, a new structure rose from the ashes, larger than the original, with proper bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and even a small parlor where Eleanor's piano from Boston would soon hold place of honor. Frank Sullivan and a crew of volunteers from Clearwater had worked through the summer to prepare the foundation and frame. Now the walls stood ready for chinking the roof beams, waiting for shingles. Home. Abigail sighed contentedly from the wagon bed. We're finally home. Frank emerged from the tree line as they approached, grinning broadly. About time you three got back, he called. We've got the framework up, but it's going to take all of us to finish before the first snow. Jackson guided the wagon to a stop and set the brake. Eager to get rid of us, Frank. Just eager to see this place come alive again, the sheriff replied, helping Abigail down from the wagon. It's been too empty here since Catherine died. A home needs a family. As they unloaded their belongings, Eleanor walked to the edge of the clearing where the trees opened to reveal the familiar view of the valley below. The stream glinted in the afternoon sun, and beyond it mountains rose in endless blue waves toward the horizon. This a wild, beautiful place had been Jackson's refuge from the world, a fortress of solitude where he'd nursed his grief and guilt. Now it would become something entirely different, a haven of love. A place where three wounded souls had found healing in each other. Jackson joined her at the clearing's edge, slipping his arm around her waist. Any regrets? He asked softly. You could have stayed in Boston, lived like a proper lady with servants and society. Eleanor leaned against his solid warmth, watching Abigail help Frank sort lumber for the new cabin walls. What kind of life would that be? She asked. Proper and empty, full of people who care more about appearances than substance. She turned to face him fully. I'd rather have one real day here with you than a lifetime of pretense somewhere else. Jackson's eyes softened with the deep contentment of a man who had finally found his way home. I love you, Eleanor Thornhill, he said, using her new name with obvious pleasure. And I love you, Jackson Thornhill, she replied, standing on tiptoe to kiss him softly. My brave, stubborn, wonderful husband. Are you two going to stand there kissing all day? Abigail called out with the imperious tone of an 11-year-old. Frank says we need to start chinking these walls before supper. They laughed, breaking apart, but keeping their hands linked as they walked back toward their new home. The cabin rose before them like a promise larger and stronger than what had been destroyed, built not just with logs and mortar, but with hope and determination. As the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the sound of hammers and laughter echoed across the valley. Frank and his volunteers worked alongside the small family, each nail driven with purpose, each board placed with care. By lamplight, they continued Eleanor directing the placement of windows, while Abigail sorted nails with the serious concentration she brought to all tasks. Jackson supervised the raising of the final roof beam, his voice strong and sure as he called out instructions. That's it, Frank announced as the last timber settled into place. She's sealed tight against the weather. A cheer went up from the workers, tired but triumphant. Jackson climbed down from the roof, accepting congratulations and backslaps from men who had become not just neighbors, but true friends. Eleanor watched him in the lamplight. This man who had risked everything for strangers, who had opened his home and heart to people he had no obligation to help. The teacher who had become a soldier, the soldier who had become a hermit, the hermit who had finally learned to trust in the possibility of love again. What are you thinking about? He asked, noticing her contemplative expression. You, she said simply. About the day you found us in that shed. If you had walked away, if you had decided we weren't your problem. But I didn't, Jackson interrupted gently. And you didn't give up when Vernon tried to break you, and Abigail didn't lose hope even when everything seemed darkest. He pulled her close, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. We found each other, Eleanor. Against all odds, in the middle of a Montana winter, 3 broken people found a way to become whole. Later that night, after the volunteers had departed, and the 3 of them sat around a campfire in front of their rising home, Abigail asked the question that had been on her mind all day. Jackson, do you think Papa would approve of us being a family? Jackson considered the question seriously, understanding the weight it carried for the child, who still missed her adoptive father deeply. I think, he said carefully, that your papa loved you enough to make sure you'd always be taken care of no matter what happened to him. He left those papers not just to secure your inheritance, but to make sure Vernon could never take you away from your mother. He smiled at the girl who had become his daughter in every way that mattered. A man who loved you that much would want you to be happy, to be safe, to be part of a family that cherishes you. Don't you think? Abigail nodded solemnly, then brightened. I think he'd like you, Jackson. You both protected us when we needed it most. Eleanor wiped away tears that had nothing to do with sadness. I know he would, sweetheart. I know he would. As the fire burned low and the stars emerged in their full Montana glory, Jackson told them stories of the constellations his Blackfoot friends had taught him, not just their names but the legends behind them. Tales of great hunters and eternal lovers written across the night sky. See that bright star there? He said, pointing toward the north. The Blackfoot call it the star that does not walk around. It stays constant while all others move a guide for travelers who have lost their way. Like you were for us, Eleanor said softly. Like you were for me, Jackson corrected. I was the one who was lost, Eleanor. For 7 years I lived like a ghost existing but not really alive. You and Abigail brought me back to the world of the living. 3 months later, their cabin was complete, and winter was setting in with its familiar bite. But this year, the approaching cold held no threat. Their home was warm and well-stocked, filled with laughter and love. Eleanor's piano had arrived from Boston, carried carefully up the mountain trail by a team of determined men who understood its importance to the family's happiness. Now, on quiet evenings, music filled their home as Eleanor played and Abigail sang, their voices blending in harmony that seemed to chase away the darkness outside. Jackson had taken up teaching again, traveling to Clearwater twice a week to instruct the children there in reading and mathematics. The town had no proper school yet, but the parents were eager to provide their children with education, and Jackson found deep satisfaction in returning to his first calling. You're different when you come back from teaching, Eleanor observed one evening as he hung up his coat, snowflakes melting in his beard. Different how? Lighter. Like you remember who you were before the war took so much from you. Jackson pulled her into his arms, spinning her around the kitchen until she laughed and demanded to be put down. I remember who I can be again, he said, setting her on her feet, but keeping his arms around her. Thanks to you. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell softly outside their windows, the 3 of them sat around their fireplace, exchanging simple gifts. Eleanor had sewn Jackson a new shirt from fabric purchased in Clearwater, while he had carved Abigail a set of wooden animals that delighted her beyond measure. I have something for both of you, Abigail announced, producing a carefully wrapped bundle. Inside were 2 photographs, portraits taken during their trip to Boston, showing Eleanor and Jackson standing together, their faces serious, but their eyes warm with contentment. The photographer said families should have pictures, Abigail explained, so people remember how happy they were. Eleanor's breath caught as she studied the image, the first photograph of herself since Vernon had destroyed all traces of her previous life. Her hair had grown out full and soft, and her face showed no trace of the fear and desperation that had marked her arrival at Jackson's cabin. "We look like we belong together," she said wonderingly. "We do belong together," Jackson replied, placing the photographs carefully on the mantelpiece beside the picture of Catherine he had never removed. The past and present stood side by side, both honored, neither diminished. As spring returned to the Montana mountains, bringing with it the promise of new life and fresh beginnings, Eleanor discovered she was carrying Jackson's child. The news filled their home with such joy that even the arrival of an unexpected visitor could not dampen their spirits. Dr. Williams rode up to their cabin on a warm May morning, his face grave with news from the territorial prison. "Vernon Reed is dead," he announced without preamble. "Killed in a fight with another prisoner 3 days ago. I thought you should know." Eleanor felt a strange mix of emotions, relief that the threat was finally permanently ended, but also an unexpected sadness for the waste of a life, consumed by greed and hatred. "How do you feel about it?" Jackson asked later, as they walked together along the stream where he had first taught Abigail to fish. "Free," Eleanor said after a long moment. "For the first time in over a year, I feel truly free. He can never hurt us again, never try to take Abigail away, never threaten what we've built here." "And the baby?" Jackson asked, placing his hand gently over her still flat stomach. Eleanor's smile could have lit the darkest winter night. "The baby will grow up knowing only love and safety. He'll never know what it means to be afraid of the people who should protect him." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "Or she," Eleanor amended with a laugh. "Either way, our child will have something I was afraid Abigail might never have, a future full of possibilities instead of fear." On a golden October day, as the aspens turned brilliant yellow against the evergreen slopes, Eleanor gave birth to their son in the bedroom of their mountain home. Dr. Williams attended the birth, declaring both mother and child healthy and strong. Jackson held his son for the first time with the wonder of a man who had never expected such a gift. The baby had Eleanor's dark hair and what appeared to be Jackson's gray eyes, though the doctor assured them eye color might change. "What shall we call him?" Eleanor asked, exhausted but radiant, as she watched her husband with their child. "Harold," Jackson said without hesitation. "For the man who loved you and Abigail enough to make sure you'd always be protected. For the father who made it possible for us to find each other." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears of joy. "Harold Jackson Thornhill," she whispered. "Welcome to the world, little one." Abigail, now 12, and feeling very mature in her role as big sister, appointed herself the baby's chief protector and teacher. She sang him songs their mother had taught her, told him stories about their adventures, and promised to teach him everything Jackson had taught her about the forest and its creatures. "He's going to be the smartest, bravest boy in all of Montana," she declared with characteristic confidence. "With Jackson for a father and you for a mother, how could he be anything else?" As winter settled over their mountain home, once again their second Christmas as a family was even more joyful than the first. Harold slept peacefully in a cradle Jackson had carved himself, while Abigail helped Eleanor prepare a feast worthy of the holiday. Frank Sullivan joined them, as had become his custom, bringing news from town and gifts for all. The sheriff had become not just Jackson's closest friend, but a surrogate grandfather to Abigail, and now to little Harold. "Got a letter for you," Frank announced after dinner, pulling an official-looking envelope from his coat. "From the territorial governor himself." Jackson opened it with curiosity, his eyebrows rising as he read. "They want me to consider a position as territorial school superintendent," he said with amazement. Seems word has spread about the success of the Clearwater classes." "That's wonderful," Eleanor exclaimed. "You could help establish schools throughout the territory." "It would mean traveling being away from home more," Jackson said thoughtfully. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that." "I think you are," Eleanor said softly. "And I think it's what you're meant to do. You have a gift for teaching Jackson, not just children, but adults too. Look how you taught Vernon's men that there are consequences for cruelty. Look how you taught me that I could be strong again." Jackson studied the letter, then looked around at his family, his wife nursing their son, his daughter playing with her wooden animals by the fire, his closest friend sharing their warmth and fellowship. This home they had built together was his anchor, the place where his heart would always reside. "I'll consider it," he said finally. "But any decision I make, we make together. We're a family now, and families face the future together." On Harold's first birthday, as autumn painted the mountains in brilliant reds and golds, they held a celebration that brought friends from Clearwater and neighboring homesteads. The cabin was filled with laughter and music, the sound of children playing, the warm buzz of community that Jackson had thought lost forever. As the evening wound down and their guests departed, Eleanor found Jackson standing on their porch watching the sun set over the valley that had become their world. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found us that day?" she asked, slipping her arm around his waist. "No," Jackson said without hesitation, "because it was always meant to happen. Every choice I made, every path I took after Catherine died, led me to that moment in the snow when I heard Abigail calling for help." He turned to look at her, his eyes bright with certainty. "We were meant to find each other, Eleanor, meant to become a family, meant to prove that love can heal even the deepest wounds." Eleanor smiled, thinking of the scared, broken woman she had been just 2 years ago, shorn and beaten, convinced she was worthless, running through a blizzard with nothing but hope and desperation to sustain her. "You saved us, Jackson Thornhill," she said simply. "We saved each other," he corrected, pulling her close as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "And we'll keep saving each other every day for the rest of our lives." Inside their warm, lamp-lit home, Abigail was putting Harold to sleep, with a lullaby their mother had taught her, her young voice sweet and pure in the quiet of the evening. The sound drifted out to the porch, where their parents stood together, proof that some storms, no matter how fierce, eventually give way to clear skies and new dawns. Jackson Thornhill had learned to believe in promises again, the promise of tomorrow, the promise of family, the promise that love once found could weather any storm. And as he held his wife close under the endless Montana sky, he knew with absolute certainty that this was the greatest promise of all, that they would face whatever came next together as a family bound by something stronger than blood or law or circumstance. They were bound by choice, the choice to love, to forgive, to hope, to build something beautiful from the ashes of what had been lost. And in the end, that choice had made all the difference.